Well, depending on how you look at it, I'm led to believe that we're all poor. The ones that are the most poor are the ones that have the largest so-called bank accounts full of debt. Something called Federal Reserve notes. It seems to me they got more debt than anybody else. The rich, so
Yeah,
to speak.
yeah. If you, yeah, I see your point. Actually,
Well, the
No,
other
that's
thing is think about it. The Somebody talked about the elite one day, and they talked about the elite live by the rule of own nothing yet control everything, and they
yep.
were like making this argument that, well, we're all just paupers, but the elite, blah blah blah. I said, think about it. The elite paupers too. How do you get that? I said, don't they live by the principle of own nothing yet control everything? Well, guess what? If you don't own anything, you're a pauper. And they said, oh my, I never thought of that.
Yeah. Well, the reality is you and I have talked about, preacher, that in the real world technical sense, none of us technically can own a damn thing, especially within the so-called matrix, the so-called legal system. They've told you several times, told us all, that we technically can't own a damn thing, which I think is really pretty funny because, you know, for the most part, even myself, I'm still having to unwrap the mind around ownership. Every once in a while, I still catch the self claiming
oh,
things as mine.
guilty,
You know,
guilty.
right?
I just
Well, yeah.
started it about 6
It
months
was
ago. So
well, it's because we've been programmed from day one to think that everything that we see belongs to us. You know, as children, we're even taught, you know, go get your toys, go get this, go get that, go get your whatever. I'm your mommy. I'm your daddy. Well, no, not really. I don't really own you, and you don't really own me. But yet, that's the way we've been programmed, the way parents were programmed, grandparents, and so on. So, yeah, it's one of those generational things that it becomes very hard to unwrap the mind around. But I can assure you, at least from my own standpoint, the more I unwrap the mind around ownership, the more free I feel.
well, free will. That's the big one. You know,
Well,
I
yeah.
grasped that concept for a long time. You know,
Well, one of the
you don't
things that
have
I
to
look
do
at
it.
too is the
You don't have
idea
to.
that if you have all these material things that you claim ownership to, you become a slave to that material stuff.
Yeah.
You know, if you got a bunch of cars, you have to maintain them in order for them to be drivable. If you have a house, you have to maintain it in order to keep it sustainable and livable.
What
Now,
if you
that
had?
doesn't change much if you realize that you don't own it, but yet it's one of those things that, in terms of myself, once I started realizing some of these things, the want for lots of material stuff minimized real fast, and I started realizing how much I didn't really want to be tied down by a lot of stuff. A couple things maybe, but not so much a lot. You know.
What if you have 4 houses and 3 cars?
Well, I don't
I
have
do.
4 houses, but
I
yeah,
do.
I get what you're
I
saying
do.
though.
I'm a
Right. Well,
landlord
that's just it,
also.
you know, because with
You
four
know?
houses, that's 4 times the maintenance. With 3 cars, that's 3 times the maintenance.
Yes.
I'm happy with just one of each right now.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I hear you. I used to have 9 houses, so I downsized quite a bit.
Yeah. Of
Yeah.
course,
Well, ever.
any of that stuff, you know, when it comes to, especially if those are like rental income property things,
Yeah.
I'm not so totally against that. In fact, one of the things with this so-called mortgage, one of the plans is once I've made this so-called mortgage go away, I know how the
What's that? What's a
lending
mortgage?
system is. The banks, as soon as they see that thing cleared out, they're going to want to. There will be lenders crawling out of the woodwork to try and throw loans at me.
Yeah.
And what I will probably end up doing is take a couple of those loans, turn around, buy some so-called income property,
Yeah,
and
I
make
don't
those
have
mortgages
I don't
disappear
have a
too.
mortgage, so I know because I get offers every day.
Oh yeah, I bet.
Every day.
Well,
It's ridiculous.
check this out, Tim. Several years back, after I saw the video, The Money Matrix, Understanding the Gap, and listening to that brother talk about how he would deal with so-called credit cards and such, I started doing that. I started playing with that shit. I'd collect as many so-called credit cards as possible, max them all out, and then just not pay them. You know, knowing that there is no such thing as pay and all these other things. What usually happens is in the first few months after you don't pay, they'll ring your phone off the hook, which I
Hmm.
don't mind at all because I like that stuff. It keeps me sharp every time I pick up that phone and they start asking me questions. I go right into what I do. But the reality is, as soon as they stop calling, they typically charge them all off. And then within another month or two, I've got every one of them are coming right back at me, offering me more. So usually within a year to a little over a year, I've not only had the fun of spending all that so-called money, then I had the fun of messing with these people on the phone, and then they turn around and offer me more credit, and I started all over again. And in fact, the last time the credit score dripped all the way down into the 300s. I'm back up over 6 now again in less than a year.
Oh wow.
And I haven't done a damn thing, bro. I haven't so-called paid anything. I just fucked with them the whole time. In fact, usually what I do is I let them call, and I like it when they call because like I said, I go right into it. They start asking, trying to get me to claim the legal name, and depending on what I'm feeling like at the time, I
Oh, I
got
get hung
several
up. I
different
get hung
directions
up
that I
on a
go
lot.
with it. What's that?
I get hung up on a lot because I'm like, do you even know that's your name? You were there. You remember that's your name? I'm like, I have no proof that's my name, so I don't know why you keep asking me that. No, so I have a lot of credit cards. So I used to own a timeshare, and this company calls me International Lodging Corporation. And they're like, hey, do you want to rent your timeshare? I'm like, okay, well, what does this entail? Long story short, I paid $2,400. They're supposed to give me back $8,400 within 6 months. I'm supposed to be getting offers for my timeshare that I
Right.
only made 2 payments on 15 years ago. And I even told them that. I'm like, I don't own it, but being into this, I'm like, well, I kind of do. So, anyways, they didn't do what they were supposed to do. So I got a refund issued by them, but I had opened a dispute with Discover on it. But I
Okay.
have, documentation that says that the company's going to refund me, and Discover didn't accept the refund. So I told the people from Discover, I said, look, I'm no longer going to be extending my credit to you. And if you don't understand what I'm saying by that, then I am not talking to the correct person.
Yeah. What's
So
what they do?
they've just been calling me
Okay.
about it. They said that because on the letter, the document, it doesn't say when they're going to refund me. I'm like, well, there's a date on there, but it's not in the paragraph. So that's what you're telling me? I'm like,
Well,
come on.
that is one of those things. If it's not specifically defined, it becomes very ambiguous, and they can pretty much write it out until the death do us part. Really, they really
Yeah.
truly
Well,
can.
I shouldn't have
Unfortunately,
opened the dispute, but I was so pissed off at the time. So I'm like, all right, fine. I'll just open a dispute.
right?
I
Well,
had I had a I had a company call me not yesterday, day before, and we need to speak to blah blah blah. I said, well, you're speaking to the agent for that entity, and they get real freaking confused.
Oh, hell yeah.
Uh,
Because they won't know exactly what you're talking about.
and they're like, well, are you that person? I said, ma'am. I said, is CK Financial able to speak without an agent? I said, you're the agent for CK Financial. Well, yeah. CK Financial is an entity. Can it speak? Well, no. I said, bingo. I said, I'm the agent for that entity. Well, we don't have anything in writing. I said, ma'am, you called me. I could have swore you knew who you was calling.
Exactly right. Because she specifically asked for somebody, right?
I said that
Yeah.
shit too, and they got so pissed at me for that.
Well, you know what's funny though, and I do this depending on, like I said, depending on how I'm feeling. You know, most of the time they have to get you to claim that name first thing before they even will move on. Well, it occurred to me, especially since these people are always wanting to enter into some form of a contract with you at the back end of the call. In my estimation, I need to know who it is that I'm talking to. I need to be able to have contact information so that anytime I can contact whoever it is. So I started asking them, well, you know, can you verify who you are? And, you know, most of the time they'll give the so-called first name, and usually that's always a fictitious name because these people are typically someplace in the middle of Punjab, India or something, and they almost always have Christian given names like John Duncan or some shit like that, you know? It's like, wait a minute. I'm not so sure that that's the exact name that you were born with, the legal name that you're known to use. And they'll usually him and ha. And then I'll throw something out there along the lines of, well, you know, I'm led to believe, according to what I see on TV, that there's an awful lot of scams out there. And I ought to be real careful about who it is that I'm talking to. And you wouldn't want me to be scammed now, would you? And inevitably, they always say, oh, no, not at all. I said, well, then great. Could you please verify who you are then so that I don't feel like I'm dealing with some scam? They start babbling and mumbling because they can't do it. They can't give their so-called private information out over the phone. That's one of their so-called company policies. And I tell them, well, you know, the problem is, even if you gave me all your information, I really need the information of whoever it is that's claiming to be the real party in interest. Who's that? And of course,
Yeah,
they
no,
usually say the name of the company. And I ask them, okay, when can I talk to the company? Well, you can't talk to the company. Well, who told you that? Well, it's just the company. You can't talk to the company. Well, did the company tell you that?
exactly.
It just confuses the hell out of them. They don't know where to go with that shit.
Monocle's Pizza to my right. Monocle's
You
Pizza
better
to
go
my right.
get you some monocles. Yes, you better.
Got some
He
gin.
don't like monocles. And monocles was my wife's favorite when she lived out there. My wife has actually said, can you stop at monocles and bring some home? I said, it'll be a couple days before I get it home. She said, get some dry ice.
Hey, Pastor, I'll go buy $125 worth of monocles and send it to your wife if you'd like.
Hey, we might have to discuss that.
I mean, I'm telling you, it's literally 10 minutes away from where I'm at. There's probably 4 or 5 here in this area.
What is Monocles? Is it like a package
It's
store
a
or something?
pizza franchise in Illinois.
Oh, okay.
I lived in
My wife,
Illinois.
when she was younger, she lived up there, and she lived nearby where Tim lives.
Oh, okay.
What city is she from again?
Paxton, I think.
Paxton. Oh, that's up north.
No, not Paxton. She was just right outside of Bloomington Normal. I mean, there was a small town out there nearby
Oh, yeah.
Bloomington Normal, and I can't think of the name of it.
My son was born in Normal.
And ain't nothing normal about Illinois. That's the funny thing. That's the
So
ironic thing.
I lived there. I lived in the Bloomington Normal area. So you got like Kappa, and these other little cities over here. It's 45 minutes. I go there every couple weeks to see my friend. There's Hudson, there's Shirley, Shamrock. I mean, how small are we talking?
Oh, I'd have to ask my wife.
Is there a stoplight?
I think there might be one or two.
That's a small town if it only has 2 lights.
Some don't have any.
One on one end that says warning, you may not be able to leave, and the other one says, well, you're lucky you got to leave.
Yeah. Way back when I was a kid, the grandparents and a couple of the aunts and uncles lived in this little town in the middle of Washington State called Prosser. Total population of 15 people. 9 of them were children. The grandfather was the mayor and the owner-operator of the fucking gas station in town. And that's what was City Hall, was the gas station. You don't get much smaller than that.
Hey, let's talk about an unincorporated village or town or city. What do you got on that, Pastor?
I don't know. I'd have to ask. Like I said, I'd have to ask my wife. But I know you're not far from it. I know that.
No, that's not what I was talking about.
Oh.
I was saying, like, so I grew up in Grand Blanc, Michigan. It's near Flint. And then there was a little sign on the outskirts of town of a Wigville unincorporated. So I was, asking your thoughts on that.
Well, unincorporated towns are actually, their rules are different. And they actually, in some ways, you have a little more freedoms in unincorporated towns because they're corporated under the franchise of the United States.
Well,
if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
But outside of that, what specifically are you wanting to know?
No, I was just, would that be considered a private city? I guess.
It could be. I'm of the opinion, if you go through a town and you see a board of trustees, there's possibly a trust that owns that town.
Sorry, I was delivering pizza to the poor folks. They have a view of the Illinois River from their house. It's called Grand View Drive. $15 I'm getting $15 for delivering one pizza.
Wow.
Yeah.
It took me.
If you're in the right area, you can make a decent amount. My oldest daughter does that. And some weekends, she makes almost enough money for all her bills for the month. And she don't have a lot of bills. I mean, she'll make almost $800 some weekends.
I make good money doing
guaranteed contracts in football. The honest truth is, I don't know. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I don't think Lamar Jackson's going to get one.
And we do cash orders also from Papa John's and Pizza Hut. Which is kind of nice. You get the FRNs.
So, Popeye, I'm getting the documents together for the probate court.
Oh, this is Popeye? Hi, Popeye.
Yeah.
I've heard many stories about you.
Yep.
Oh, man. Hopefully most of them are good.
Not really. Pastor was telling me.
Of course, Pastor tell you the truth. That'll scare everybody off.
Don't give away all my stories.
No, I was going to do what you did, but I was going to make a copy of that card that they gave me. I'm the guy that called Social Security Administration, recorded it. I'm that guy. But I'm not as educated as you folks are, but I wish I
Yeah,
was.
he was listening to me talk about where you're not the beneficiary, and he had a hard time with that. So what did he do? He called the Social Security Administration a couple different times, and they finally told him, well, yes, you're not the you're not the beneficiary yet. I said, see, that means somebody else is a beneficiary. And on top of that, you're only a limited beneficiary when you reach the position to get that benefit. Because like Medicare, Medicaid, when you get to retirement, those are all limited beneficiaries. The question is who is the actual full-fledged beneficiary?
Well, they
And
were
that's where
supposed
I
to
say
send
the
me.
state is.
They were supposed to send me an email with all those answers. You know that. I'm
Well,
like,
there's
so
what they
what is my
supposed to
relation?
do. What
What
they
is my
supposed to
relation
do
to
and
this thing?
do is two different things.
Well, of course, the big thing, preacher, is this, and I would have to agree that in a technical sense, yeah, the state is probably the full beneficiary. But as we well know, if you start asking to meet the claimant, whoever it is that's claiming that claimant will never step forward. We know
True.
this. We know this.
That's why.
So no matter
Well,
what
that's why.
position you might want to play at the moment, as long as you understand that if you keep asking whoever the claimant is that's claiming you either can or can't do whatever the hell it is that you're doing, until that claimant shows up, you're good to go on whatever it is that you want to do.
Yeah, but that's where you need to know the principles and know how to articulate your position to
Sure.
basically make the judge submit to it.
Oh, yeah. Well, for sure. That's the one thing that I absolutely say across the board, like we were talking about last weekend. You got to know what your position is. You got to know how to talk about it. You got to know how to defend it, because if you don't, you're going to get yourself in a world of hurt.
So here's my view of it, and Pastor knows I'm not ready. But you got to know who you are and who you're not at which time, or you're going to get in trouble.
Well,
Like,
actually,
you got to know who you're not and who you want to be, and who, you got to be able to switch the positions or put on different hats.
Well,
That's
I
what the
just look
judges
at
do.
it like this. You just need to know who you are as a player in the game. Now, you can adjust your position around to a couple of different spots and all of that, but ultimately just understanding who you are as a player in the game is really the most important part, because that'll tell you who you're not as well in all of that. That's kind of the key thing, at least in my estimation. And of course, the big part, since it's all contracts, everything is contracts, the position that you are in, who you are as a player in the game, is the only real party in interest. That's who you are. You're the only real party in interest in all dealings with anything GovCo and or corporation.
Actually, you're not the real party of interest, and here's why I say that. What you create, you control, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Who created Social Security?
Well, not us.
That's right.
Well,
Wasn't Congress? Yes. Well, guess what I found in Westlaw? And it has to do with the real party of interest. There's actually a code in Westlaw that discusses this. And I'm thinking that's where we need to use it to
Our advantage.
To our advantage, yes.
Well, the thing is, too, and this is where I will throw in this caveat, because technically, whenever any so-called banks or creditors or GovCo, they're actually addressing the name, the one thing that they did create, and the one thing that they hope that you will claim so that they can claim jurisdiction over you. So that being said, it really is a very fine line, because technically speaking, the real party in interest in terms of that would really be the name, because if you're not the name and you're separate, then but they're always trying to contract not just with the name, but the person claiming to use it too.
Well, what I had found on Westlaw is this phrase called the United States for the use and benefit of, and just fill in who's after of. And there is a bunch of freaking court cases that have that phrase. And then there is a U.S. code that actually talks about this is under the Miller Act. Are you familiar with the Miller Act?
I've heard of it. I'm not. I'd have to look it up.
Miller beer?
No, not Miller
Oh,
beer.
okay. No,
The
no,
Miller
sir.
Act. I mean,
I know.
that's
I'm
when
joking.
you act drunk before you drink.
I used to be a
So-
bartender for a while. I hate drunk people. Ugh.
Let's see.
Huh.
Is this it? Let's see. United States as the real party of interest.
What does that mean, a real party of interest? I mean, I know what it means, but I don't.
Typically speaking, the real party in interest is one of and or whoever it is that is entering into a contract. They have an interest in the contract, whatever
So
nature.
are they liable?
Typically, they would be liable for something in there along the way, depending on what the contract is. Yes.
Okay.
Here you go, Popeye. Application of the real party and interest rule. Actions in the name of the United States for the use and benefit of other persons. Now, beneficial owner does not go to the beneficiary. Beneficial ownership does. Right?
Right.
It's very clearly laid out in Black's 11th that way, right? So, did they not give you the social for the use and benefit of the all caps name?
Yeah.
This
Well, that's
is
exactly
more
what it is.
evident. This is more evidence the name isn't yours. We're not declaring things properly. But that right there is out of the federal practice and procedure, federal rules of civil procedure. And it's section 1551, real party and interest.
Right. Yeah.
And it says at the very beginning, according to Rule 17A2, an action for the use and benefit of another must be brought in the name of the United States whenever a federal statute so provides. So now I'd have to look up 17A2 and see what that means.
Yep.
Let's see. Miller Act, the Miller Act, the Capehart Act, and look at this. This portion of the rule 17A did not appear until 1937. Why would that be? What happened in 33?
The world's greatest gold heist.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yep. And of course, most people don't recognize the significance of all of that either. In fact, because allegedly Nixon in 71 took us off the gold standard, people still think that there was gold up until 71, when the reality was we were technically taken off the gold standard in 33.
Yeah, the nation was taken off in 33. The international community was in 71, 72. Which was it?
71. But the reality is too, and this is the thing that I find interesting, is the Federal Reserve note was the cash reserve for oil trade, even at that time. And at that time, they wanted everybody to believe that it was still based on gold, but yet it wasn't. It still wasn't. Just because they had the world thinking it still wasn't. And just recently, was back in 2016, I think it was. I'd have to go back and look. It was Germany contacted the feds and said that they wanted their gold back. There were several European countries that were struggling back then, and they wanted their gold back. And the Federal Reserve told them, no, you can't have your gold back. So Germany pitched a fit, showed up on the front door threatening World War III. And so I guess from what I heard, they being the feds, powers that be, allowed them to see some gold. They took them to some vault, showed them some gold on the other side of a glass partition sitting on a table, and it was just a couple of bullions of it. It wasn't their entire gold stack. And what I heard is that the Germans reported that the gold looked too orange, like it was mixed with copper. Yeah. And they were not allowed to take theirs back, but yet I'm led to believe that Germany, Greece, and somebody else, now I'm forgetting, but somebody else, they were wanting their gold back. They wanted to go back onto a gold standard, and they wanted it in their so-called possession. They didn't want it sitting with the Federal Reserve anymore. And the Federal Reserve basically has refused to give back their so-called gold, which tends to make you believe that there's something hinky going on there. Exactly what, not sure, but I'm led to believe that a lot of it has to do with there really isn't much gold left, that it's been pretty much distributed, and they don't have stacks of gold bullion like they used to, if they ever really did. Because that's one of those where only a few select eyes ever really allegedly saw any of all that gold. So we really don't know outside of that group. The rest of us are all relying on hearsay that any of it actually existed.
Well, see, I don't really look at it that they stole the gold or took away the gold. I think they took away the hard metal, yes. But they redefined what gold was as the obligations and securities of the United States. And that was the only reason that they were able to get the world onto the petrodollar, because they guaranteed it as gold.
Well, yeah. And how somebody could have actually looked at that and know the situation and say, so you're telling me that you're going to give me an IOU and it's just exactly the same as gold? Yeah. Thank you. No, thank you. But, this is, again, part of the reason why I talk about those that do know about some of this stuff versus those that don't. Judges and the few top DAs and DA offices know about this stuff. Some of your top politicians, long-term senators and such, know about this stuff. Most of your lower end people probably don't know squat. And until they reach a certain point where they're actually able to seriously make waves, they don't learn about it, because there's no reason. It's kind of like in the military, where everything's compartmentalized. You only know what you need to know, and that way no one person can ever be taken and give out the entire plan, because they don't know the entire plan. You'd have to collect several people to put the plan together based on what each individual knows about the plan. So, yeah, it would seem to me that there's an awful lot of that in there, that because that's how the government operates. And I find it funny that the government is still that way, but yet there's people like us that are out here, and all we have to do to get past all the compartmentalization is just start looking shit up. It doesn't take, but it doesn't take long, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure some of this stuff out. It just takes some diligence, some little due diligence, and the ability to read and comprehend. That's all.
Oh man, look at this.
What's that, bud? Are you looking at pictures of me naked?
You're not that good looking.
I would hope not.
You're not built right.
No, I got the wrong attachments.
Check this out. Sending it to you. Now remember, it said, when I read that to you, it said 17A2. But the stuff right around it is very fascinating.
Action in the name of the United States for another's use or benefit when the federal statute so provides, an action for another's use or benefit must be brought in the name of the United States.
And read the next one.
Joinder of the real party in interest. The court may not dismiss an action for failure to prosecute in the name of the real party in interest until or after an objection, a reasonable time has been allowed for the real party in interest to ratify, join, or substitute into the action. After ratification, joinder, or substitution, the action proceeds as if it has been originally commenced by the real party in interest. Interesting.
Capacity to sue or be sued.
Yeah.
Capacity to sue or be sued is determined as follows. For an individual who is not acting in a representative capacity by the law of the individual's domicile. Now
that's interesting wording. By the law of the individual's domicile. That means that that's the rules that you have made up for yourself. That's how that reads to me, because that's what the individual's domicile is. That's so-called my place.
Now compare that to Rule 3. For all other parties, by the law of the state
where the court is located, except that a partnership other than other unincorporated association with no such capacity under the state's law may sue or be sued in its common name to enforce a substantive right existing under the United States Constitution or laws, and Title 28, Section 754 and 959 govern the capacity of the receiver appointed by the United States court to sue or be sued in a United States court.
See, I look at it that since Social Security was their creation, and it is a trust, and it is, if done correctly, for your use and benefit, so shouldn't it be in the United States for the use and benefit of Popeye?
Well, sure. Yeah. It would seem to me. And I do believe that, well, like we've talked about, we're allegedly the beneficiaries, but yet, some of us could argue both sides of that.
You don't even have to be the beneficiary, because why? The beneficial owner position.
Yeah.
Now, let's see.
I see that.
Owner. Now here, look at this. There you go. Now go read the beneficial owner.
One recognized in equity as the owner of something because use and title belong to that person, even though legal title may belong to somebody else.
Bingo. And what does trust law say about the trustees? The trustees have legal title.
Mm-hmm.
And the name that was given is technically was your estate that was created. And they hold the legal title.
Yep.
You see how I'm applying this now?
No, I absolutely do, and this is part of why as we've talked about, there's definitely more than one way to skin a cat. Of course, some of this stuff, as I get older, I don't want to remember all this stuff as much as I used to. I forget things now more than I used to too. So I'm looking for simplification on everything.
Yeah, it is. It is very simple.
Yeah.
You're right. It is very simple. Once you understand the principles, which you know this, the principles of law are few and never changing. Methods are many and are fluid. The methods are the processes, procedures. The principles never change. Once you start understanding the principles, guess what you no longer need? You don't need to use their statutes. You just quote the principles.
Yeah. Well, of course, like we've talked about too, their so-called code statutes and shit is all offers to contract. And if you don't want a contract, you don't have to. You can go your own way. You can keep it all in the private. You don't have to go out into the public with anything.
Yeah, but did you see that video I posted the other day of that guy? I think it was back in 1990. George Gordon. You should really watch it. It's an hour long. He brings up some very valid things. Now, here's the only problem with what he says. Based on how he's wording everything, he's starting with the same foundation everybody's starting with. That's my name.
Oh.
And now, he's not expressing it in that way, but you got to recognize his principles behind his application. So if that's the case, everything he says is 100% right. And it's all about how you contract it.
Right.
Okay.
I didn't
It
see
goes
that.
over
Drop
the
it to me
marriage
directly if you would.
license. Sure will.
Yeah, thanks. I'll
He
go over it when I get a chance. But yeah,
he goes over the social, the marriage license, why they're able to take the children, all of it.
oh yeah. Well, in fact, both the daughters are. In fact, the youngest daughter is going to get married before the oldest daughter, and I pretty much have convinced them they just need to do a common law marriage, which is still considered legal, and do not enter into a contract with the state by filling out something called a marriage license or application thereof. Because
It's called a contract of matrimony.
Yeah, and you declare yourself and your children wards of the state by doing so. Don't do that. Just like we talked about, don't claim to be a citizen. It's a very that's a very dangerous thing to do if you claim to be a citizen.
It depends on citizen of what, because you can't serve two masters.
Well, if I'm a citizen of heaven, that's one thing. But a citizen of the United States of Jamaica is a whole different thing.
Jamaica.
I thought that's what you said. But hey, so I'm getting ready to do the beneficial owner acceptance of the deeds. for the property.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like you guys were just kind of discussing, um, to become the beneficial owner. I just don't know if that will do me any benefit. And can I just take the deed in, or do I have to ask them for the deed? Do you guys have any clue on that?
Are you talking about the deed that was filed at the county when you purchased the property?
Yeah,
Then
because
yeah, I
I
would
already
go
have them.
get are they certified or authenticated copies?
I don't know. Probably not.
Then I would go get it. I'd go down to the state Secretary of State and have it authenticated. If it's not been certified, I would go talk to the county recorder or whatever the office is there, have them give you a certified or authenticated copy from their office.
Okay, so I could just go there and get it. Another one, and then just do it then, because it'll be certified and authenticated by them, obviously.
And yeah, at the county, and then you turn around and go get the Secretary of State to sign off on it and get you the authenticated. And when it sends it back to you in the mail, you do your delivery receipt for warehouse goods, just change the language. And that way, that's your acceptance that you have accepted that document.
So I guess my confusion is if I go there and I say, hey, can I get a deed? And they give it to me, why do I have to get it authenticated?
Authentication is a rule of evidence. It's an evidentiary rule. It makes the judge have to take judicial notice that it's no longer be treated as hearsay.
But they gave it to me.
You're missing the point.
I know. I guess I'm just being stubborn.
It could be argued as hearsay because does the county recorder have firsthand knowledge?
No.
I got you. So by getting it authenticated, that makes it firsthand knowledge.
No, that takes the hearsay off. That the state is basically saying, hey, treat it as if it is the record.
Well, one thing, and this is just something as a little side note to keep in mind when you're dealing with paperwork, especially when we're talking about title deeds and things like that. One of the things that was proven back in the late 50s, early 60s, is that the birth certificate, which is considered to be God's gift in the legal world for documentation. It absolutely is, because allegedly, for most people, what they've been told and their perception of it is it's proof of somebody who they are. Well, the reality is it's not proof of shit other than an event happened. It's hearsay.
Actually...
Well, hold on a second. It's hearsay at that. That being said, since the God's gift to documentation is nothing more than hearsay, wouldn't that make every other piece of documentation that is less than the birth certificate even less than the birth certificate if the birth certificate is pure hearsay? The answer to that is yes.
Hold on. It's worse than what you think, Popeye. I've got a court case, State v. Gray. It is in the file section that says the certificate of birth and or birth certificate, the certificate of live birth, and the birth certificate are both double hearsay.
Right.
So it's not even hearsay. It's double hearsay because why? Now, the principle is it's double hearsay because it's only prima facie evidence of a record. And it's the assertion of the registrar who has no firsthand knowledge.
Exactly right. And that's kind of the big thing is the reality of all of this, and this is across the board, kind of even more of a blanket thing. Everything in this world is hearsay and assumptions driven by linguistic sleight of hand. Everything in this world that we believe we know, if it was told to us, it's only hearsay. If we read it, it's only hearsay. And the reality of this, and this is one of those where people get kind of butthurt over it, but the only real knowledge of anything is your experience, something that you've either been involved in or you were witness to. The problem with that is, and this is something that is a major issue in criminal law, is people's ability to recollect accurately the events that they were either involved in or witnessed.
Yes.
And the reality of it is, so many times, even people that were involved in the event can't remember some specific guy. He was tall, he was short, he was fat, he was skinny, he was wearing brown, he was wearing pink, he was wearing blue. Cowboy boots, high heels. Nobody remembers exactly what. This is part of why videotape so often is really helpful, because then it'll give us the actual picture of what took place. And it's still not 100% accurate because it's not going to see everything. But the reality of it is, we only know what we've experienced, and that's only as good as our ability to recall it accurately. And most people don't recall things very accurately. And I can even say from my own personal experience, I've missed things in the past. So, for as much as I think I know, I may not know nearly as much as I think I do.
And men's recollection is actually worse than women's. No offense, guys. Women don't forget nothing.
They got fucking brains like elephants. They remember everything. Yeah, olive oil fucking jumps on me about shit that I said fucking years ago. I was like, damn, how the fuck do you remember that shit? So, yeah. This world is very flawed.
It's just like people out there, they talk about authenticate the birth certificate, you'll be able to discharge debt, but whatever. They don't even understand what authentication actually means.
Yeah.
You're asking the court to
who?
treat it. Yeah, you're asking the court to treat it as if it is the record. The problem is you don't even know what's in the record.
Yeah. Well, most people have not even really read the birth certificate and looked at things such as where the mom's name is and where it says mother or other informant. It's calling the mom an informant. And if you don't know what an informant is, look it up.
Well, not only
informants
that,
are something that happens in criminal law.
Well, not only that, the reason why it's put down is you cannot testify against yourself. So think about it. When I showed my birth certificate, did it in the descriptive document of what was going on? It says in it, this is the firstborn infant of the type ORH negative mother whose projected date of confinement is 9/24/73. They do not name the mother. Why? You cannot testify against yourself.
Yeah.
So the mother's coming in saying, look, we found this infant, not the baby, the infant. And if you go to the fourth sentence on that same document that I show, it says he was found with and it goes over the stats. I said, well, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, well, this is part of why I so caution people when it comes time to play in that paperwork world, because, well, even like what I did with the request for adequate assurance and due performance, even though most of it is in the form of questions, technically speaking, I just have a stack full of hearsay that I'm willing to take to court and hope that the judge accepts it, But technically speaking, it's all hearsay.
It is.
Most people have no idea. And this is part of why when you're in court, they have hearings, not readings, because they don't want to hear something off of a piece of paper. They want to hear something out of the person's mouth, that firsthand testimony. Because even a motion to dismiss or anything like that, anything that's in there is all hearsay. And of course, this is one of those things where judges know this stuff, most people don't realize, but judges know these things, and they're not going to say anything to anybody because, again, he who will be deceived, let him. If you think that you're doing everything right and you're doing everything wrong, the judge isn't going to tell you. They're going to let you do what you do.
They will tell you in their ruling that what you didn't do sometimes, but they're not going to tell
sometimes,
it in the case. Do what now? Changed again? What was you going to say?
Hey, it's Ashley. About the hearsay.
Hey, Ashley.
How are you? Okay,
I'm doing well.
Tim. Oh, good, good. How's your puppy?
Oh, she's spoiled as ever.
Good.
She's back here sleeping under the blanket right now.
Oh, nice. Hey, Tim, you were talking about the paperwork at the county. Is that correct?
Yes, young lady, I was.
Okay, this is what I would do. I would go into their office where they have their computers and search up your records, print up everything you can. And usually when you print, at least in my county, the printer is backed by the ladies, the ladies behind the counter. So they pull the copies off so that when you print your, let's say your warranty deed or any of that, anything like that, you have them certify anything right there as they're pulling the paperwork off the printers for you.
So I don't have to go to Secretary of State.
Well, no, yes, you do.
So I would
but
still.
you're getting your first I would call it your first proof of documents that it's coming off their printer, their sticker, their signature, their pressed seal. Because if you go in there and say, I want this, can you give it to me? They're going to look at you like, what? So you're going to pull it up yourself, and the actual copy will come from their printer.
Yeah, and then sometimes you get them to authenticate it, and they do have a county level authentication. You do it right there.
You do it right there, and then document what you're doing. Depending which office, which room you're at, some of them you some of them don't. But it's, you can definitely, that is your, I guess your best layer of proof. And then,
well, I already have the deeds.
Well, yeah, but you still need to take those deeds.
So get them authenticated.
Yeah, it's like having a bottle of 2-liter soda. What you have is a 2-liter of soda with the cap loose. What Pastor's talking is making it all airtight.
Yeah.
So you have a good bottle of soda, if you drink soda.
Yeah.
I love soda.
Yeah. So it's why I laugh at a lot of these people and that talk about authentication of the birth certificate. They don't even understand what it's for. And I didn't at one time. I think it was like 4 years ago that me and David Roach in Indiana, they have the best explanation that I've seen in their rules of evidence when it comes to authentication. That's how I learned what authentication really is. Because you have two types of documents, authenticated documents and self-authenticated documents. In other words, if it's self-authenticating, it's a fact. If it's not self-authenticating, then you need to get it authenticated because why? It's considered by the courts to be hearsay. And the only reason hearsay is allowed in a courtroom is if the parties agree to it. So if you don't, that's why you need to get it authenticated. So that way the court has to take judicial notice of as if it is a fact.
They take judicial notice, don't they? Like for me, I've got the probate file in California.
Mm-hmm.
I am loading all of my evidence that I have.
Yes.
Um,
Now, in the probate file, sometimes those court files might be considered self-authenticating, but it's still stronger if you take those files down to the Secretary of State and have them authenticated. And yes, there is a process to get legal documents authenticated.
yeah, so I'm gonna have them legally authenticated here in St. Louis, and my probate lawyer in California said he would electronically file everything that I send into the case.
Mm-hmm.
And then my thought is then having the case or the documents transferred from one court in California to the court in Missouri where myself and all the players of the party are.
Yes,
Would that make
that's one of the
sense?
yes, because under the probate, that court has jurisdiction until one of the parties that have interest has the file moved to the proper probate court.
Okay, because I'm in the probate court already under the guardianship.
Yes.
And then, so it would be me moving it after all the files are uploaded? Is that, I guess, do I just
You
make a
just make a
request?
request. You make a request to the California court, and I would send notice to both courts. Make a request to the California court to have the entire file moved to the court you're doing business at. That way, that court, they know they're the receiver. When they get it, they can let the California know we've accepted your documents, blah, 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 however way the court does it.
Okay. And the only other grace I believe I have is my mischievous or devious brother-in-law put my parents' address as the business address of the LLC that I'm in dispute of,
Yeah,
which is in the county of where we live.
yeah.
So I would think it would be like much more difficult for the judge to be like, "Oh, this is California. I can't do this."
Yeah.
Since part of the, information is in the county that we're dealing with.
And now the other thing is why you potentially would get them authenticated, and this goes back to the good faith and credit clause. I was
Yes.
reading the other day, I think it's in the, what's it called? The Articles of Confederation.
Mm-hmm.
There is a good faith and credit clause in the Articles of Confederation that all the courts and the governments are supposed to accept the records from other courts.
And most people don't know this. I don't believe.
They don't.
And
No, they don't.
I don't even think lawyers, they don't even try to go outside of your county, but if they would use that clause or that premise, some states have better, let's say rulings.
Yes.
So that's
again,
what I'm going after.
One of the things that you have to keep in mind, especially with attorneys, is kind of a twofold thing. First and foremost, their loyalty is always going to be to that court, not to the client. Mm-hmm. That being said, most of these attorneys will cater to the court in that the courts don't like to see a lot of old legislation and or case law because so often it shoots them in the foot and quickly reloads. They want newer, more up-to-date, more compliant rulings to hear from these so-called attorneys. So that being said, you got to realize that these attorneys are going to look for basically minutia. They're not going to look for the real substantive stuff. It's not their does not benefit them to do so. As long as they can keep the court happy more than
Against that, all
anybody
you got is
else.
bring up the fact. If they argue against what you're doing and it's based on the organic laws, you bring up that argument. The organic laws are still in force and effect because the organic laws is what produced the government. And we have another term called the supremacy clause.
Well, and there's also the enabling clause, which basically means that the Articles of Confederation were not eliminated by the Constitution. The Constitution was built on the strength of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles are still in place.
Yes.
So most people don't even know that. And judges don't want you to know that shit. They'll stomp their feet and pound their chest and tell you, oh, that doesn't have any application here and all this other shit. Well, the one thing that everybody should always keep in mind, when a judge says something like that, when a judge ever makes a claim, put that judge in check and simply ask the judge, are you putting up surety for that claim? I can assure you that's going to shut that judge down right now if that judge doesn't even fully run out of the courtroom. And I know that they do because I have done it before. Ask them that simple question. Are you putting up surety for that claim? And that will shut them down, I can assure you, because no judge is ever going to want to put up surety for any claims that they make in that courtroom. They aren't. They are going to be afraid of that. Hold their feet to the fire.
And on top of that, according to the rules that I found out of New Hampshire in the federal court when I was researching the CRIS system, the Court Registry Investment System, and needless to say, because it got exposed, they took it off their website. But I still got access. It even says that no attorney can be surety for anyone except maybe a family member. And then they still need the court's permission to be surety. And if you know that every judge is an attorney by the state constitutions in most every state, they have to be a member of the bar.
Yep. Yep. I love this stuff because that's getting into the part of this stuff that I really like, which is to essentially be putting these judges and DAs especially, but any other GovCo agents, on notice. Because once you start saying things like that, especially judges, they know that they're not dealing with their average Joe Schmuck ragman from down the street. And typically speaking, and I would have to believe that, especially like with the judge that I got to run from me twice in one day, he knew that if he continued, there was going to be a couple of different problems. One, he was going to have to prove to the DA how I wasn't guilty. But two, he was putting himself up for personal liability, which means that he was basically removing the corporate veil himself and leaving himself out to dry because he was then acting on his own accord. Of course, they all are acting on their own accord, and that's a whole another issue there. Every government agent is truly acting on their own accord. They're acting on pure hearsay. You want to talk about some hearsay? Here's some hearsay. No GovCo agent has ever met with the stack of paper with ink on it called the city, the county, the state, the Fed. More janitors have actually seen the filing cabinet that stack of paper resides in, that sits in, than GovCo agents have actually seen that stack of paper. And of course, since a stack of paper cannot speak like I'm speaking now, it cannot point to those GovCo agents and say, I now appoint you as a representative of me, and you now have authority over other men. It cannot say those things. It cannot do that, which means that no matter what, it's always been just some other man or woman that has told the next guy down the ladder that you now work for the state, the city, the county, whatever. That's pure hearsay. And they are all working on their own accord based on that alone, in a very technical, real sense. That's
Yep.
really the best part, because once you realize that, now you technically have every one of these so-called GovCo agents by the short hairs. You seriously do. If
Tell
you
us
know
how
how to
you
deal with that, you got them. And they
tell
can't
us
do a
how you
damn thing about
really
it.
feel. Tell us how you really feel.
I should learn how to open up, brother.
No, you're very passionate.
Well, that is true,
Well,
because I take this stuff to heart, very much to heart. And the reason being is because,
Yeah, I
well,
don't
a
want to
couple
get
things.
myself in trouble. I'm very passionate myself, and I don't want to get in trouble.
And
look,
believe me, I understand that, brother. And in fact, passion can get you into a lot of trouble. But the whole reason why I got into this was because they pissed me off. They being GovCo agents. I was arrested for growing cannabis here in California, where it was supposed to be legal for me to do so. And when I was done spending my first 13 days in jail right after I got arrested, I made a vow that I was going to learn how to beat these bitches in their own game.
What's cannabis?
Allegedly, it's some flower that helps
Oh yeah, I don't know
medicinal.
what that is. So I don't. How can you blame me for doing that? I'm
I
taking the
know, right?
pastor answer.
You have no
Well,
first-hand knowledge what it is. All you know is it's a plant God created for your use and benefit. That's all you know.
that's it. And in fact, if anybody ever came up to you and said that's marijuana, you simply ask them, okay, well, who told you that? Because simply put, again, this is all hearsay. It's everything. This is another part too. Everything, code, statute, regulation, legislation, I don't care what it is, everything that is written down or everything that is spoken is all ambiguous. It's all ambiguous. It can mean whatever anybody thinks it does. So, yeah, there's problems with it on both sides. But the reality is, once I made a judge, and it was actually the supervising judge of the courthouse, and it wasn't right away that I realized it. It wasn't until after that I realized what I'd done and went, oh, shit. I actually got these bitches running from me. I'm in good shape now. But yeah, once you can do that, and it only takes one question for a judge, especially, and of course DAs too. I know, because I going through some of this stuff way back when. I'd ask DAs. In fact, one day, standing in the courtroom, this little Asian lady was standing in front of me, and I asked her if when I could meet the claimant and when I would get a chance to settle the matter honorably and all that. And she said something about, we don't do that around here. And I asked her if she was putting up surety for that. And she ran away from me saying, I don't want to speak to you off the record anymore. I said, that's great. Let's put it all on the record then. She didn't want to have anything to do with me. They changed DAs out right away. They started changing DAs out on me like people change their underwear. It was daily.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you
And
start
when
asking that question, they don't want to have anything to do with you because they know where you're going.
Yep.
Because they know, based on that alone, they know that you're planning on suing them if anything happens. That's the whole reason for asking that question, because if you weren't willing to sue them, there's no reason to even bother asking that question. But I can
And if you
assure you,
ever
once you
get
do,
one of
they
them
know.
yeah,
What's that?
What question?
if
I
you
was
ever
inside the
get
store.
one of them, if you ever get one of them that test you and they don't think that you know what you're doing, and you ask them, are you putting up surety for that claim? And they get smart and say yes, then just turn around and say, let the record show that blah, blah, blah has accepted surety for that claim.
There
And
you
now I
go.
am giving notice to the court of my intent to sue them on their surety.
Yep. And of course, the way you do it is you would not sue the DA as the DA or the judge as the judge. You sue them straight as Joe Schmuck, the ragman, not Judge Joe, just Joe Schmuck.
Yeah.
Because what they're going to do, they're going to scramble like madmen to put that corporate veil back up between you and them, which means that they're going to claim that they are representing the city, the county, the state, which is exactly what you want them to do, because now the burden of proof is on them to prove that the city, the county, the state actually exists beyond a stack of paper with ink on it by having that city, county, state, whatever, step up onto the witness stand and give some firsthand testimony. They're done. They can't do that. And until they can, they got nothing. Now, the moment that they can actually get a piece of paper with ink on it to step up on the witness stand, we're all in trouble. But I don't see that happening. Not in the near future. Not in my lifetime.
AI.
What's
They
that?
could just autonomous robot go up there as AI is the state of Illinois. No, so what got me into this was child support.
Okay.
You know, I'm like, why am I paying the state to pay you? That makes no sense to me. None whatsoever. It's like, it makes no sense. It'd be like somebody paying their rent to the state and then the state paying the rent to me, right? I mean, it's basic, same concept. Yeah, I could be
Yeah.
wrong. So why doesn't that work like that, but this works like this? So it just made me question. And then I ran across and met this guy, sounds like Dr. Phil, and
I don't
says,
know who that is.
you know why? Because why?
Well, I've never actually dealt with family court and applied some of this, but I've talked to a few brothers that allegedly have, and seems to me that it still should have application. One of the biggest problems that I see with family court is there's never any juries in there. There's never a public that's allowed to even sit in the gallery during hearings and such, which means that there's nobody really to keep these judges in check, which pretty much opens the door for them to do whatever they want.
Yeah, well,
Oh,
the
no.
other problem is this. The people, they take advantage of the people's ignorance, okay? One,
all the
that
time,
man
yeah.
or woman in that black robe in family court is not a judge in a family court proceeding. Why? He's an arm of the administrative agency, which means he's only acting in a ministerial capacity.
Yeah. Well, there's actually court cases that say that too. So for anybody that doesn't know, yeah, there's actual court cases that straight up say there are no judges. There hasn't been since like 1929. There's only administrators.
To see those cases.
Yeah.
If you can pull those up, that'd be freaking great.
Yeah. I'll post them to you. But yeah, it seems to me that, again, there's just so many little aspects that people don't realize, they don't recognize. And it's not that the information's not out there, because it is. And in fact, this is one of the biggest things. Most people think that GovCo is highly corrupt and they're being completely dishonorable. Well, the reality is they might be corrupt, but they're not in dishonor. The reason why they're not in dishonor is because they've already disclosed pretty much everything. They've already told you how corrupt they are. They've already told you all the different pieces to everything that we've talked about already this morning, even. The lack of ownership of the name, the lack of ability to pay for things, and so on and so forth. It's all out there. And as long as they have disclosed it all, they are still in honor. And that's even along with the fact that, yes, they're still acting fraudulently, not in fraud.
Yeah,
This is
constructive fraud, we can definitely discuss that.
Well, yeah, but the reality comes down to this, and like you and I have talked about, Preacher, if you're advertising a 64.5 Mustang convertible, and I show up to pick up that car, and there's no 64.5 Mustang convertible, you actually have a 68 CUDA convertible sitting there, and it's fully restored looking tits. I love CUDA convertibles, so I decided I want to go ahead and take that CUDA convertible. You got me there under fraudulent conditions because you've been talking about the 64.5 Mustang this entire time. The reality is, when I got there and I saw the CUDA, I consented to the CUDA because I wanted the CUDA, because I liked it. It was perfect. It was everything I'd ever dreamed of. That consent negated the fraud. Now, if I showed up and I wanted that Mustang and you had that CUDA, now it's fraud because I don't want that CUDA. I wanted the Mustang. Now it's fraud because I'm not going to consent to it. And basically, this is everything that GovCo does, because essentially, and this is something that most people don't realize, but yet if you've ever studied any of the Jordan Maxwell stuff, one of his big things is he tells everybody everything in government works exactly opposite, 180 degrees out from what everybody is led to believe. And this is true. This is absolutely true. So when it comes down to it, if you don't realize, and of course, this is kind of like with the idea that, the victors write the history books. Well, whatever you read in the history books, if you really want to know the truth, just kind of figure everything the opposite of what they're telling you in the books is probably more likely true than not. Well, the same thing applies, like with mortgages. If you sign that promissory note, you are now the one that's actually funding the loan. The banks don't lend money. They buy promissory notes. It's the opposite of what most people think. What's that, brother? You're hot micing, I think.
Yeah. And that's actually true.
Yeah.
It's like everybody blames the Federal Reserve and say they're the bad guys when the government says, hey, we have these securities or these bonds. Do you want to buy them? Well, who is the issuer of them? You are.
Yep.
All they're doing is turning around and selling it to the Federal Reserve so they can print more money. You want to stop using Federal Reserve notes? Learn how the banking system works. And guess what will happen? The Federal Reserve will go out of business.
Yep. Yeah. It's the funniest part of some of this is it's all so simple. If enough people, not most, but if enough people started recognizing and just stopped playing the game, the game would come to an end. I'm led to believe that if just 2% of the people that are supposed to be going to traffic court today didn't show up, it would have a major impact. It would damn near shut down the court system as it is.
Well, not only if they didn't show up, but even if they did show up and they knew who they were as a player in the game, it would shut it down.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And one day we were doing a quick estimate, me and a brother that was in there for a so-called traffic ticket. And we just kind of did an average based on the fines that the so-called judge was issuing out and the number of people based on how many people were in there. And with the previous visitation on a night court, kind of taking an overall average, roughly about $60,000 in this one courthouse alone per day. 60,000 so-called dollars in so-called fees and fines. That's a ton of so-called money.
Now, if you imagine
lots of people getting raped.
What if you now turn that around? What if you knew what Mark knew? What if you knew what the coffee bean case, and you started going in there and asking the right questions? Crazy Mark up in Minnesota, what did he do? He settled the ticket with grains of rice.
Yep.
I mean, then what? Then they're not getting these promissory notes to be able to trade them and sell them.
Yep. And of course, at that point too, because you're not using a Federal Reserve note, it also doesn't add to the so-called national debt. And that's something most people don't recognize either. The national debt isn't from the government borrowing money nearly as much as it's from the people using debt notes as money. They just keep increasing the debt because they don't realize that by handing over a Federal Reserve note, they've just handed over one more IOU. They've just increased the debt by handing an IOU over to someone. Most people don't get that.
Speaking of debt notes, I have been researching my own deeds of trust, my title work, my insurance title policy, my promissory note, and on my let's see. On one part of my title work, my title policy, it just it just speaks of the deed of trust, the date it's executed on, and the book and page. And on that line, they're only referencing the cover page of the deed of trust. All the other exclusions in the title policy, if there's a document that has 5 pages, they're evidencing it by marking every page, citing every page. And my deed of trust claims that the mortgage is for a non-owner occupied mortgage. My note cites that the mortgage or the loan is for an owner occupied loan. So when I think about correcting my deed or accepting it, there's so many mistakes between all the paperwork. Would you correct it on your own on the record first? How would somebody handle that when there's mistakes between the note, the deed of trust, the title work? There's not even a true legal description.
Does the deed use the term owner anywhere on it, or does it say tenant?
Let me look.
I was just going to ask that question.
Most people go look at the deed and
mine say tenant. Mine say tenant.
Well, there's your answer right there, dear. You're not an owner. You're a tenant.
I am a tenant. I'm not an owner. True.
But I'm saying, though, even in a real world sense, if you were the one that allegedly was the owner, you're technically only a tenant. This is, again, one of those disclosure things where they're telling you can't own anything. That's some disclosure right there.
Hold on. She has the contract that says it must be an owner-occupied dwelling. That means she can't be a tenant, and that means the deed is fraudulent.
Well, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah. Very technical sense.
Well, if
the deed isn't fraudulent, then that means we know the note is. That says owner occupied is fraudulent, because you can't not be owner and tenant.
No, you can only be one or the other. You can't be both. Nothing can be and not be at the same time.
So yes, you need to start bringing up these facts that, according to the contract, there appears. Love that word, appearance. Love that word.
I will love it.
Put it in your language and say what? The appearance of fraud.
Well, I would even suggest that you start off by saying, I believe there may be a mistake because there's the appearance. You just by simply saying that word mistake, you reset everything.
Oh, and I say there's a mistake. Do I take this to the courts?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the appearance of a mistake, because a mistake can be fixed, an error cannot.
And one cannot be convicted on a mistake.
Yes.
Okay. So at the end of the day, what would be the goal for you guys if this were your situation at the end of the day?
To change you from tenant to owner.
Okay. And would you still be fine with the note, the promissory note?
The owner is the actual undisclosed third-party investor, and that goes right back to the law of agency. You issued, as the owner, a private negotiable instrument in the name of the trust. And how do you evidence that? By the name and social, and the liable parties are the trustees.
Mm-hmm.
You were the private banker that issued a private negotiable instrument.
Didn't I issue 2, though? I mean, the deed of trust is a security instrument, too.
Yeah. Well,
I
typically
mean, and
speaking,
it has all the loan terms.
Well, it may, but do banks loan money? No,
No.
they buy promissory notes.
so what you end up with, and typically speaking, going through escrow, most escrow companies, most mortgage companies have you sign 3 promissory notes. The application for the mortgage is also converted to a promissory note, which ultimately means before you even walked out the door for that last time at the escrow office, they've made 4 times the amount of that loan off of you because of your signatures. And they've got you convinced that you owe them with interest. In reality, they actually should have been paying you. They should have just handed you over the so-called money and then said, thank you so much, and showed you to the door.
Now,
Well,
under the
Because in
law
right.
of
that loan agreement, well,
agents,
hold on for just a second, preacher. And the reason why I say that is because in all loan agreements, it always says he who funded the loan must be repaid for that funding. If you're the
and
one that funded
you
the loan
funded
with
it.
your signature, you're it.
Now, under the law of agency, what you did unbeknownst to you is appointed them as sub-agent for the trust. That's why they're able to go create all these accounts like the escrow and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
The
So with
sub-agent only has the sub-agent would be a special agent. A special agent can only do certain things.
I just read that today in the book you provided. It's
Yeah,
for
and a
one thing.
sub-agent is very close akin to an assignment. Not exactly, but it's very close akin to.
Well, this is what we're getting ready to go over through corpus juris secundum, because corpus juris secundum is greatly more detailed than that book.
Well, and
Do
there's a
you
couple
know
other
that the
things.
agency and principal position actually is a private position too?
No.
Yeah, because in corpus juris secundum it says that when you are the agent, you are stopped from admitting you are the agent. Now, if you know why, you understand why it's a private position. Okay? Because
Is it
why?
you don't
You
want the
were
third
never
party?
supposed No, you were never supposed to be doing business with the creditor. You're supposed to be notifying the principal, and the principal can never settle anything because we're never notifying them. See, we keep wanting to put things into the public. Like the
And
W-4 process, we keep wanting to go to the IRS, which is the public accounting firm, for the principal.
And the principal would be the Social
The
Security
trustees.
Administration. Yep.
The trustees that are listed on the website.
okay, so I should contact the principals.
That's
Mm-hmm.
right, and tell them the credit you issued
Okay, and then
in the name of the trust.
okay. Now, when you have let's see, the title insurance policy, one of the things they required, and of course I signed off. I feel like such an idiot, but that's okay. I'm learning. Where
Oh,
they
don't
Yeah,
are.
feel
don't
like an
don't feel bad.
idiot.
We all been through it, dear. We've all
Yes,
Oh,
we
learned, and
have.
I've
and
been
some
doing
of
this
us
for
have taken some
25
serious
years,
hard
then.
smacks to the face.
But it says, let's see, any provisions and the conditions and stipulations of this policy referring to arbitration are hereby deleted. So is that lawful to remove arbitration processes?
If you
Or I
agreed to the
guess
contract, yes.
okay, so then I agreed to that. Okay. And then I guess the next thing is when they speak of on the
Now,
okay,
under the
on the
argument of constructive fraud, if you prove constructive fraud in the contract, it negates all the waiving of those rights.
Okay, well then that shouldn't be too hard when when your promissory note, the first line is, for the loan I have already received, comma. I mean, that's the loan probably from your application.
From the trust, yeah.
So on the general warranty deed, it says the witnesseth that the said grantor for and in consideration of the sum of $10 and other valuable considerations. They're referencing two instruments.
Now that's interesting that it says that, because see, that goes back to the old law. When people would purchase land, they would give a $10 gold piece, and what would happen is the agent would give the other person dirt.
Right.
So they gave you lawful consideration. You gave them lawful consideration, evidenced in the document, of $10. Did they
But I
give you
didn't.
anything back? No, you didn't. You're right.
I
But the point
didn't.
I'm getting at is, did you put a down payment?
Yes, but that's on the contract. I mean, the way they do the
No.
contracts.
You can actually argue the point that, hey, they actually did not correctly list the consideration. I gave $20,000 for consideration. Where's my other $19,990?
Right.
See what I'm
True.
saying?
Oh, I do. I mean, to me, this is the constructive fraud, because
Correct.
the reading of everything in the real estate sales contracts refers you as to, buyer or seller, and then you go through the whole mortgage process, and everything's got to be exactly, the street, if it says street, you know, they're always saying, oh, you need to correct this. This says street, you have ST. But yet, as soon as you get to the closing table, they've converted everything. So
Yeah,
there's
they've
like this
converted everything.
conversion.
And
Conversion.
I would be willing to bet this, that if you really get down to what they've converted everything to, they never sold you, one, the house or the land. They attached everything to the easement.
There's like
Because what is
easement.
the mail? Well, go look at what is the mailbox. Who owns the mailing address? The municipality. What is the address attached to? The easement.
Yeah, everything. And I've got 5 or 6 covenants for easements on here.
Yeah, so they can't sell you the land. Why? They're
Well,
not doing it right. They never gave you dirt.
no.
Well, of course, there's one thing too. This is something to consider. It's a little unknown thing, and some people would argue this, but the reality is it's still the same, and that is a fiction, a cartoon, Govco and or whatever, the Tooth Fairy, cannot own anything in reality, especially land. Now, people will say, "Oh, yeah, but government still owns this and they still own that, and they still got all." Yeah, well, that's because people even believe in Govco. Period. Once you start realizing that Govco isn't any different than the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus, you realize that, okay, well, then technically speaking, the cartoon can't own anything in reality. And that's the truth. Now, again, he who will be deceived, let him. For all those that do believe that, well, then they're good to go. And Govco is going to continue to do business as usual.
I don't want to own anything. I just want them to quit bothering me and saying I got to give them these FRNs.
Well,
They
that's
can't. No,
essentially
they
the
never
reason
tell
why
you
I'm doing
that.
the mortgage deal, is just to make sure that I've got a place to live for the rest of the life, and I can will it off to the children and never have to worry about anybody ever taking it away.
Yeah, well, I don't
But
have a mortgage.
hold on now, Tim. I very seriously doubt, you're going to have to show me in your documentation that they actually tell you to give them Federal Reserve notes. I guarantee you they
Hey,
don't.
stop. You know what I mean. Quit it.
I know what you mean, but I'm going to always get on to you to start analyzing the documents correctly. They can never tell you in what species to make a tender.
Read Title 31, Section 5118, and HCR 192. They cannot demand a specific form of payment. And in fact, in there, about 3/4 of the way down, if you read Title 31, it'll actually say that no debts can be paid. They can only be discharged. It does say dollar for dollar, but it does not define a dollar. That being said, of course, for anybody that goes back to what we're talking about, Mad Mike with the grains of rice and Eugene Glazer with the coffee beans,
Yeah.
money is whatever any two or more people agree upon in a contractual situation. It's called sufficient consideration, but the reality is anything for the most part can be sufficient consideration. A fistful of dirt could be considered sufficient consideration. That's money, technically speaking. And since a dollar, the word dollar is a unit of measure, the same as a pound is a unit of measure, or a gallon is a unit of measure, or a gram, or whatever. The key question here, when somebody says, you owe me dollars, you ask them dollars of what? In fact, Preacher knows about this one. I had a conversation with the so-called probation officer after I sent an A for V in, accepted for value on the so-called statement that they sent me for so-called fees and fines of being on so-called probation. And we spent nearly 40 minutes him trying to get me to admit to knowing what the word pay is. They
Now,
asked me
look,
about
hold
tax
on,
and
hold on,
checks and all
Popeye.
this other
Before you
stuff.
continue, let
Yeah.
me clarify one thing. Y'all got to realize he is on probation, risking going back to jail doing this.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, they threatened to take me back into court even that day. And I just kept asking them, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And it finally literally came down to he starts asking me, well, if you're driving your car and it starts to run out of gas, and I asked him, what do you mean by a car? And what do you mean by drive? And what do you mean by gas? So he literally, I thought he was actually had been listening to some of my phone calls and conversations with people because he used the words that I've actually used myself. Well, you're navigating a mechanical conveyance down strips of asphalt and it runs out of that stuff that makes it go. What do you do? And I told him, well, I go to that place where you get the stuff that makes it go. He says, well, what do you do when you get there? And I said, I put the hose in the side of the mechanical conveyance. He says, well, what do you do after you get there, but before you put the hose in? And I said, I get out of the car. And he said, well, what do you do then? I said, I'll walk to the hose. I would not admit to doing anything called so-called pay. And I just kept asking him more questions and answering the questions that he'd asked just as straight and basic logical as I could. The conversation started to go a little stagnant. So I asked the brother, hey, brother, if I was to do this thing called pay that you're talking about, would I need to own something to be able to pay something? So he asked me, so you don't own anything? I asked him, well, is there any evidence that I do? So now we go on to this other conversation for a good 10 to 15 minutes about what ownership is. Finally, he gets down to the point where he asks me, well, who owns the clothes on your back? I looked this brother square in the eye and I said, I'm led to believe God. This bro went silent for a cool 10 seconds. I can prove it because I got it on recording. When he picked up that conversation, he changed directions. He would not touch pay. He would not touch ownership. And no matter how much I brought those subjects up, no matter how much I would talk about Federal Reserve and money and checks and debit cards and whatever, I could not get him to take that conversation up again. He left it the hell alone. And ultimately, they sent a notice to the name after I was off the so-called probation and said they discharged the debt. They did use that exact word, discharged too. Imagine that.
So I had a suspended license from Michigan when I moved to Illinois. And about 2 years ago, I got a letter saying that they're not going to, renew that driver's license thing here unless I take care of those. So I had called the court, whatever, and got the amounts. And then I waited about another 6 months before I actually was time to do it. When I had called back, they had told me something very similar to what you're saying, is basically, well, it hasn't been paid in X amount of years, so we just discharged it.
Well, the one that I actually think is even more interesting is when Preacher had a ticket and called the court clerk, and that ticket was live at the beginning of a 7-minute phone call. He mentions that the name belongs to the Social Security Administration, and literally that case went from an active ticket in front of the court to, oh no, that case is now discharged and sealed.
Well, they said sealed and dismissed.
Yeah. Whatever.
Yeah. And I've got the document to prove it. It's actually online. It's on Floyd's channel. It's on my TikTok. I mean, it's when you start understanding the principles of how this system works, it will change how you do business. And that's really what it is. It's a business. It's nothing personal.
And in fact, after I did my shit with the courts, there was still an issue after the fact where the name would not pass a so-called background check. And so during the Rona year, 2020, I had to have a telephonic hearing. Well, the telephonic hearing was with the last judge that I had been in front of when I said I'm led to believe there's been a mistake about the name. When we get on the phone, he asked me if I'm such and such legal name. And I said, yeah, that's the name that I'm known to use. He said, okay, asked about the so-called birth date. And I said, well, allegedly, but I was awfully young that day. But then I asked the judge, would it help if I told you that those are the numbers that are on the so-called birth certificate? And he said, yeah, that'd be fine. And that was it. And typically speaking, we're talking about judges that would be flipping out, especially if you said, well, that's the name I'm known to use. They'd be asking, well, no, are you such and such name? But like I said, this is a judge that had already been through it with once before. So he knew not to go down that path with me, because the last time I was speaking to him, he was referring to me as peaceful inhabitant.
You didn't happen to record that conversation, did you?
God, I wish I had. No, unfortunately, that was one of those that I failed to record. But damn it, if I had, that would have been excellent. That would have been perfect. It would have been.
Never put it in the public because they frown upon that.
Oh God, they'd have a shit fit, because that would be exposing the system for what it really is.
Yeah.
And how much they have to get you to claim that name.
And this is why I tell people that 90% of the gurus out there really don't know what the hell they're doing.
Exactly right. Because if they don't talk about the things that we're talking about right here, and especially if they're not starting with the name. And in fact, one of the so-called gurus, Mark Stevens, refers to it as the name game. And this guy not only says that is complete bullshit, but he also denies that anything is contracts, because he says, well, there's no evidence that there's contracts. Well, the reality is, like we were talking about earlier, the contract happens in the mind. There's not going to be any evidence of that.
I really think Mark Stevens sold out, because he used to start from the same standpoint of the name and contracts, but then he got away from that and started doing exactly what you're saying.
Well, and also his real start to where he really got his biggest success was asking for evidence of a claimant. Mm-hmm. The same thing I do. Is there a claimant? He asked for evidence of a claimant. Same thing. It's one and the same. But of course, the reality is you can't make any money off of that. And I keep preaching that, and that's part of why I do what I do, and I don't charge anything, because this is simple, basic shit that everybody should know. Basic contracts ought to be taught in public schools at least 5th grade, in my opinion. But the reality is, there's never going to be any evidence of a contract. Most people think that the contract is some piece of paper with ink on it. No, the contract is when you come to the end of the meeting of the minds, basically the discussion of what do you mean by this and what do you mean by that, coming to all the terms and conditions. Once that has been fully and thoroughly discussed, you now have what is known as formation. That's the contract. And that happens in the mind, and there's no evidence of thought. The reason why we write things down, ink on paper, is we memorialize. We are memorizing what we just discussed on pieces of paper with ink.
And
the written
now,
so-called contract is known as the memorialization. It is not actually
Yep.
the contract. It's the memorialization of the contract.
And that's the reason why in rules of civil procedure that the judge has to reduce everything to writing.
Yep.
Because why? If it's not reduced to writing, there is no understanding of the parties.
And this is where, especially, and it's spelled differently, it's parole with no E on the end. Parole evidence. Parole evidence is the spoken word. And only upon rare occasions will a judge in a contractual situation take testimony as to hearsay, because that's what it is. If it was way after the fact, it's now just a simple situation of he said, she said, and the judge has no way of being able to verify. He has to take what everybody says and figure which is the most likely to be true.
And that's the purpose of the administrative process, is that way you perfect your side of the he said, she said argument.
Exactly right. Just like with what I've done with the so-called mortgage. In fact, how interesting it is, I had to do a total of 6 requests for adequate assurance of due performance. That's what you do when you're in a contract with somebody and you think that there might be a problem. And because of the fact that when I sent the first request to the mortgage company, they hot potatoed the mortgage over to a third-party debt collector and sent me a notice saying that they completely absolved themselves and washed their hands clean of any of it. And then they sent me a notice saying, they were going to answer all my questions and have everything to me as soon as they possibly could. But they still haven't. It's been over 60 days and they haven't done that either. But I used a complete administrative process. I kept it very simple. And the notary has now filled out witness statements to each and every document that she not only signed, but addressed the envelope and stuffed the envelope with the documents that she has not received. All but one responses have actually come to the house. They did send one to the notary. So I do actually have one witness statement that says that they did send one thing, but in that notice that they sent back, they didn't answer any of the questions at all. They basically were completely in dishonor of the entire request for adequate assurance. So, and based on the language in the letter itself, in that notice, because they dishonored that request, they have agreed that there is no real party in interest and there is no debt. They agreed to it. And now the third-party debt collector has also done so. They've agreed, not me, they did, based on their lack of response.
And you got to have a notary or a process server or what is it? What's the term? A third party.
Yep.
You
Could
got to
even be
have
a friend.
non-biased third party.
Yep.
That will give them what you have. If you send it certified mail, okay, all you can prove is you sent an envelope. You can't prove what's in it.
Yep. But if you send it with the signature required at the other end, now you can prove that it was received by somebody, and not only received, but signed for. and you can pull up
Yeah.
that name as to who signed for it.
Yeah, but you still need somebody like a notary that can do an affidavit of what went in the envelope, because that only proves that you sent an envelope and they signed for the envelope. It does not prove what was in the envelope.
Yeah, that's why with the witness statements, I have them saying that they're the ones that stuffed and addressed the envelopes with the documents to these people. Yeah, but you want to keep it simple too. You don't want to get too convoluted, and you don't want to put the notary in any position where they're essentially verifying the validity of the documents themselves, because they can't do that. That's not their position. They are only there to basically be a witness to you signing it, and of course, as doing the administrative process, their part in that process. And that's all they can do. But this is a big key. I've heard some people like Yusuf L on high frequency radio talk about paying that notary to be that third party independent witness and utilizing the administrative process. I completely disagree with that for two reasons. Number one, it's their duty as a notary, and if you get one that does shipping, like at a UPS store or something like that, FedEx or whatever, it's just part of their job to do all that shit anyway, because that's what they do. They sit there and pack stuff up to be shipped all damn day long. As a officer of the court, it would basically put the appearance of an impropriety if you were to pay them to be a witness for you.
That
And they're an officer of the court. What's that, brother?
That could be construed as witness tampering, because now you've compensated him for what could potentially be a false testimony. But I don't think that's exactly what he means. I think he, the way I look at it is, and when I've actually reviewed his webinars, and I've actually done this with notaries. You're basically, yes, most notaries will charge you, say, a $5 fee for one of their documents to do the notary, and then you reimburse them for their time on the post and the postage.
Right. Yeah. And since they're an officer of the court, again, they're just like every other officer of the court, their first loyalty is to that court, which is you want to keep that in place anyway. And again, if you pay them or anything, that appearance that their loyalty might be to you would be part of that impropriety. You don't want any of that, because you want them to maintain that loyalty to the court, so that they're going to testify to exactly what it is, regardless of whatever you might want anyway. That's part of the idea of doing the administrative process, so you have that third-party independent witness to testify to what they saw, not what you want them to say. So at this point, I'm actually now waiting for essentially 29 more days. And just like I did with the original mortgager, I've got a very short notice of dishonor and confirmation of agreement that I'll be sending out. And in there, it states that since there is no real party in interest, there is no mortgage, that it is also agreed upon that they're going to sign over any title deeds and or liens and or other document attachments to said property. So now I'm just sitting back waiting for them to get it done or file for foreclosure, in which case then I'll just show up. Well, first I'll answer with what I've already done, and the judge is going to have a hard time not finding in my favor anyway, because they're going to have a hard time looking at everything I've done and having clean hands, staying well within the clean hands doctrine. All my I's are dotted, all my T's are crossed. Because unless the mortgage companies, either one of them, can bring up any of the stuff that I've asked for. Everything that I've asked for is completely prudent and reasonable, well within my so-called rights to do so. So, yeah, it's going to be a hard time for the judge to not just default judge in my favor, summary judgment.
Hey, you need to look at that document that Cold Money just posted called Charging Language PDF.
Let me see.
That is like if you could find that, if we could find that in every state, that would be awesome.
Let me take a look at this here.
And you got to scroll down past the table of contents and see if you see what I saw. Go to page 13.
Common law. False imprisonment, obstruction, hindering, forgery.
Now, doesn't it give you a dollar amount?
Let's see here. No. There's no dollar amounts.
Okay, not on every one of them, but hold on. Scroll to page 14.
Dollar amounts.
There's your tax.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, even on these, what do you mean by dollar?
I know. It always goes back to that. But that's the first time I've actually seen an actual compiled list of really what you could argue is the tax for the charge.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. Because it's actually showing so-called dollar amounts attached to, each one of these offers to contract.
Yeah.
And that's all this is more offers to contract. Would you like to contract with us? This is what it will cost if you do. Of course, most people don't get that you can add your own charges.
Yeah, because both parties are actually supposed to be bonded in the admiralty jurisdiction system. I'm waiting to get lucky to debate this attorney on TikTok.
Oh, yeah? You got somebody talking some smack?
Oh, yeah. He's a family lawyer in New York. And he commented on a guy's video, and he exploded after that. Because why? He's one of those lawyers that, he talks about the craziness of the sovereign citizen movement. And I will go in and watch his lives on TikTok. And he has other attorneys that are friends. I got probably about a half a dozen attorneys that I follow and or follow me. And U.S. Law 101, I think is her name. She's a constitutional attorney. And I was commenting on his live the other day. And he said that, she's a constitutional attorney. And he said, I bet she would make you look stupid. I said, I have much respect for her, but I sincerely doubt it. And they were talking about, he said, the sovereign people talk about maritime law and it's contracts. And then I commented and said, actually, contracts in commerce. And then he said, you ain't one of those sovereigns, are you? I said, what do you mean by that?
Well, there you go. Yeah,
I mean,
that's one of those
constitutional
phrases that
attorneys.
people like to banty about, and
Yeah,
so often they couldn't even fully define whatever the hell they mean by it anyway.
yeah, constitutional attorneys. I respect them. I respect attorneys for the most part because look, they play the game every day, and they can actually give some very great information. But they don't realize some of us actually started from the foundation and started coming forward. And law school never does that.
Mm-mm. No, you don't learn the history of anything. You just learn essentially law school. For anybody that's wondering, law school isn't about learning law. There's some law learned along the way, but what law school is primarily is learning how to get past the bar.
Yeah, that's it. After
Law
that, you're on
school,
your own.
yep. And the reality is this: the reason for it is every so-called county, state, city, they're all going to have their own slightly different variations of this, that, and the other. So you would always need to learn the intricacies of wherever it is that you work after you pass the bar. They do teach you some basics on law, and that's part of what it takes to get past the bar because you have to know some basics. But you don't really learn law in the sense that you learn specific code, statutes, regulations, or anything like that. It's all just generalities, and pretty much more than anything, what they're looking for is people that can argue both sides of the story. That's the
Yeah.
biggest thing. If you can argue both sides of the story, if you can actually play devil's advocate very well, then you're probably going to pass. If you can't, then you're probably not.
I mean, didn't you say a long time ago when you started your 2-year degree that in one of their books they even admitted that everything is contracts?
Well, no, and of course the pre-law was actually a 4-year. It wasn't 2-year. It was a 4-year.
Oh, okay, 4-year. Okay.
Yeah, it was a bachelor. It's a bachelor's of science. It's a 4-year degree, but there is some things where they do talk about that, and it's actually more in civil law, and essentially one of the biggest parts is where they talk about minimal contacts. And most people don't understand what that is, but that's what the court looks at to determine whether or not you actually have a contract with the city or the state, thus then giving that judge, that court, jurisdiction over you. Minimal contacts is certain things such as, are you using a so-called address in the area? Do you have a phone with a so-called area code that's within the area? Is there a so-called car that you're using that's registered in that area? Is there utility bills coming in the so-called legal name? Is there whatever? Anything like this is considered to be minimal contacts. Minimal contacts is what they look at to base whether or not there's a contract with you. And it's a total tacit contract. And it's the same thing that they do in criminal law as well. They just don't want you to know that it's all contracts. Even in criminal law, it's all contracts.
Yep.
All
In
right,
fact,
I actually
that's the
had a
big thing.
conversation. I had a
Well, I was just
conversation
going
with
to.
Mike Slosser. He's a retired attorney. And he asked me one day, he said, how good do you think you are at contracts? I said, Mike, I said, everything is contracts. I don't care if it's criminal or civil. He said, I don't agree with that. I said, Mike, really? I said, when you was a defense attorney and the judge asked you questions, I said, did you ever once consider asking the judge, what did you mean by that? Or did you just presume to know what he meant? And as soon as he thought of it from that spot, his mouth dropped. He then got it. And he said, you teach me things I'd never thought of in all my years of practice.
Well, there's two parts to it that state straight out without it actually being anything other. and first and foremost is the so-called Constitution. The Constitution is supposed to be a contract. Everything's supposed to come under the Constitution, including criminal law.
Yep.
Well, if it's starting with the contract, it ends with the contract. It doesn't change somewhere in between. It doesn't change at all. And then there's the whole part of everything is, again, an offer to contract. So even at that initial state where they're charging you with something, if you're claiming the name, then you claim to be under the contract. If they've asked you these other questions and you've answered yes to them, such as, what's the address, and the address is in the area, this, that, and the other thing, you're consenting to it all. And of course, at the back end of this is where the Clearfield Doctrine is so important as well, because it clearly states in the Clearfield Doctrine, when a government forces you to use private currency, which is essentially what they've done, because the only thing that is considered to be legal tender is a Federal Reserve note. It's a private bank. It's private tender. By doing so, they have reduced themselves to being no different than any other corporation, a person, and essentially there's still no different than your next door neighbor. They have no authority over you unless you consent to a contract. And this is how and why they need to have a contract in the moment, because they don't have any long-term contracts that they can actually prove. Just like we talked about earlier, there was no meeting of the minds. So they know that they actually have to get that contract in the moment. And that's how they do it. Part of the reason why when I did the whole name thing, and when the judge, instead of calling me Peaceful Inhabitant, called me Mr. Peaceful Inhabitant, he was trying to add a term and condition. He was offering to contract. Had I not called him on that, I would have been accepting that offer to contract. He would put his jurisdiction right back on my head.
That's like that guy that had that toothpick in his mouth.
Yep. Bailiff, arrest that man. Yeah. And for anybody that doesn't know that story, his brother knew who he was as a player in the game. He was standing in court, and the judge couldn't get him to claim the name or anything, and he kept asking to meet the claimant. So finally the judge told him to get out of there. But this brother literally forgot who he was and where he was for just an instant, about 3 steps from the door of exiting that courtroom. The judge said, "Oh, and by the way, pull that toothpick out." He'd been chewing on a toothpick the entire time. He reached up and he pulled it out, and as soon as that toothpick left the lips, the judge said, "Bailiff, arrest that man." He accepted the contract. He accepted the offer. That's why when I said what I did about the name at the end of the hearing that day, when the judge said, "Peaceful Inhabitant, we need you to come back on such and such date for another hearing," I asked the judge, "Hey, Judge, would it be okay if I come back on such and such date to help settle the matter with the claimant?" I took his order as offered a contract, and I turned it into an invitation. Oh, Reacher, I think I may have told you about the 2 nursing homes that were trying to attack the mom's estate for some so-called debt owed. I think I told you about that, didn't I? Okay. I'd sent off the 3rd notices and now sent the notice of dishonor and confirmation of agreement to the so-called attorney that was handling it for the so-called nursing homes. And a week after I sent that notice out, I received a so-called bill, or the mom did, from both the so-called nursing homes. It's almost as if that attorney has absolved themselves of that situation and just handed it back to the nursing homes that you deal with it. I don't know for sure. I'm just waiting to see if anything happens. But yeah, I hadn't been receiving anything, or the mom, in the mom's name, the legal name, from the so-called nursing homes for the last several months during the time that I was dealing with the so-called attorney. And now all of a sudden the last notices were sent. I'm receiving now these notices from the nursing home. Yeah. Funny stuff. And of course,
Share your
those places.
YouTube channel in here so that way people can go check out your videos. I mean, his phone calls with the credit card companies and stuff, as in demanding who has firsthand knowledge, stuff like that. Some of them are funny.
Oh,
I
yeah,
was just
they're
gonna
hilarious.
say, is this the guy that does those videos on the credit card companies? Because
Yep,
you've helped me immensely.
Awesome.
I've
That's
learned a lot
great.
from you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, because that's what they're
What's
up
the
there
name
for.
of the channel you're talking about?
Street legal thinking.
Yeah, Street Legal Thinking. Is that the channel you're thinking of?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is him. This is Popeye.
Yeah.
Papa,
Matter of
I got a
fact,
question.
go for it.
My friend, he let me know. He goes, I've been getting these mailings from lawyers. I said, somebody's filed something then. I said, because now they're prospecting you. So we went down to the county and pulled up his file. There's a petition from a law firm, trying to collect on a credit card debt that has already been discharged, according to the bank. There's an affidavit from an officer from Bank of America saying she has firsthand knowledge of all the bank's books and record keeping. And there's a couple other things. And they've been trying to serve him. And I went and got a completely printed out and certified copy of all those documents. A judge has never signed anything.
Okay. So they
Is
essentially
that?
are just bullshitting right now.
Yeah, but
Yeah, they're
I
posturing.
kind of love I love the idea that there's an executive from Bank of America saying, I will come testify. I have knowledge of everything.
Awesome. Perfect. And she says that she
Yes.
has firsthand knowledge. The thing that I would drill her on, and I would bury her, is I would question every aspect of how she has any firsthand knowledge of anything. Because first and foremost, it's going to start with the so-called contract, the original agreement between your friend and whoever the real party in interest is there. Whoever it is that actually provided the so-called credit. And if it wasn't out of her so-called pocket, and or she was not a party to and or a witness to that initial conversation, and of course we're talking about, typically speaking, if it's been like with me, they just filled out an application online. There was not
Right.
even a meeting with anybody. So how could she possibly have had firsthand knowledge of that? Was she sitting on the other end of the so-called computer? And even so, if she couldn't see the friend actually typing anything in on that website, how would she know that anything was done by the friend? How would
Oh,
she have any firsthand knowledge of that?
I agree. Now, can they do this with and he's already got a court date
Technically, no.
Yes.
That's the whole thing. Well, they can do
without
it,
a
and the
judge's
judge might get it, but they can't get away with it if you ask the right question.
but
That's
without a
right.
judge's signature.
Well, judge's signature doesn't necessarily mean anything, and this is one of those where I go right back to asking the judge if they're putting up surety for anything, because if they play in favor of the bank or the creditor in any way, shape, or form without being completely biased, they're going to end up making a claim somewhere along the way to do so. And once that judge makes a claim, you ask that judge if they're putting up surety. That will put that judge in check.
Okay, because this is like one of the judges that handles almost all the credit card cases. I mean, and
Yeah.
this company, this law firm, I mean, I think they just go after. This is their main business, I believe.
Well, one of the things too, and keep this in mind, and this will be the same thing for me if the so-called mortgage company decides to take things to court and we actually get so far as to actually be in court. No attorneys can actually testify. And typically speaking, that's all that's ever going to show up in court. And usually, especially on the first so-called hearing dates. Well, that being said, they're going to attempt to testify. And the counsel cannot be both witness and counsel. It puts them in a conflict of interest. So that being said, they can't walk in there and testify. They basically can only counsel. Well, if their real party of interest isn't standing there with them, they have nobody to even counsel, which means that they're pretty much moot. You just put a muzzle on them and they can't say a damn thing. The only one that can actually speak then is you or the friend, actually.
Right, right. Well, and is there a way to say, okay, Miss, we want you to testify. We want you to come down and testify.
Well, yeah, and it broke up. Could you repeat that?
Is there a way to, get the lady from Bank of America to say, we accept your offer to testify because knowledge of all the bank's books and procedures?
Well,
would there be any reason to have her on there, or to just try to get it dismissed based on what you just shared?
I wouldn't even go after her. I would just simply, in any so-called documents that I would submit or anything that I would state, I would keep it very simple and just be straight out asking to meet with the real party of interest, because they're the only ones that can have a couple of different things. First and foremost, they're the only ones that can have the first-hand knowledge of any dealings. Secondly, they're the only ones that could actually provide the evidence and or the first-hand testimony for any of it. And in reality, of course, this is one of the biggest things with all things legal. Technically speaking, if you're asking for the real party of interest to settle the matter outside and independent of that court, thus to not create a controversy, giving the court jurisdiction, because that's the only time the court actually has jurisdiction is when there's a controversy. If you don't create the controversy, then there is no jurisdiction. And by you simply wanting to stay in honor and meet with the real party in interest, you're staying in honor. You're trying to settle the matter outside and independent, such as you're supposed to do before entering into the court. And like one of the brothers earlier was talking about disputing something, anytime you dispute anything, you create the controversy. That actually automatically puts you in dishonor, because you, without actually meeting with that real party of interest, you're now disputing something that you really don't know for sure needs to be disputed. Does that make sense? Did I lose you? Or...
No. By the way, when you ask the question, can that CEO come and testify? Oh, yes, they can. Hi. But the problem is, do they actually have firsthand knowledge? The answer is no.
Well, that's it. Yeah, they can testify all day long, but the reality is, and the way to handle that is you ask the court, does the court accept hearsay as firsthand testimony? And of course, if she claims to have firsthand knowledge of something, she's the one made the claim that she has it. Now it's her burden to prove it. Onus probandi. And if she can't prove it, that claim needs to be found against her. Which means that basically at that point, if the whole suit goes south on their part, she needs to be the one that pays up, because she's the one claiming to have all the first-hand knowledge that can settle this matter. Oh, and just as a little update for anybody that has watched those or listened to those recordings of me with the credit card companies. Last year, I did that shit for probably the third time now after learning what they do as far as they being the banks and stealing our so-called promissory notes and all. When I first spent all the money and maxed out the cards and didn't make anything called a payment, according to the so-called credit card companies, they dropped the credit score on the name down into the threes. It was up into the sixes and sevens. And it's been just a little over a year now, actually a little bit more than a year, close to a year and a half now. And all those credit scores are right back up to 6 and 7s again. And haven't done a so-called thing called payment of anything. Just simply kept asking to meet the real party in interest, whoever's making the claims. And they ultimately just charged off everything.
Are you going to do a video on that?
Actually, well, yeah, this we were talking about. It's, there's on the channel, there's a bunch of those, but I'll be, in fact, I've been pretty busy lately with business and I've been sick for a bit. So I got away from doing some videos, but I'll be getting back to it. And yeah, I'll be covering that. And I'll be covering also everything that I've done with the mortgage and then updating when I get updates. But yeah.
Okay. Cause, I'm in battle with, 2 school loans and one loan with One Main Financial, and I've been going back and forth with them, not accepting their invoices and then writing them back, telling them that I need all of their financials of where that money came from. And it's been like all I'm doing is playing hot potato with them for almost a year now.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to do that.
I'm not really getting anywhere.
Well, this is part
I
of
just
why.
actually shared his link to his YouTube channel, yo.
Yeah, when like with the mortgage, this is something that I originally, kind of to back the train up a little bit, way back when. This is probably 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, when I started learning about all this stuff. I had a few things on the so-called credit score that was bringing the credit score down. And so I started with the smallest of the so-called debts, and I did accepted for values and made a whole bunch of them go away, all but the 3 biggest so-called debts. But during that time period, I was also learning more and more, continuing to expand the knowledge and all. So I decided to completely shift gears and not do any more accepted for values and just simply call up these so-called third-party debt collectors and start asking to meet the claimant, whoever it is that has the first-hand knowledge. And that's where I literally cut the teeth on all of this. Well, in that process, and it's interesting that you mentioned student loans. I'm going to be doing one on the student loan for the law school. One of the brothers that I initially helped, brought him into this way of thinking, and literally for days on end at one point, every night we'd get together in a call and we'd role play. And he has since taken care of a few debts, including a student loan with Nelnet of, what is that, like 180,000, 160,000, something like that. So it can all be done. And he did it simply with not doing any documentation like I've done with the mortgage. He did it simply by calling them up or whenever they would call, asking to meet the claimant. And ultimately, they finally just discharged it. At this point, prior to me doing the so-called mortgage, which is nearly $500,000, between 3 or 4 brothers and one lady that did a mortgage of $97,000. We've done somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 400,000 so far, and so-called mortgages and debts, and even auto loans. A couple of auto loans of 20 to 30,000, just gone. And this is with no paperwork involved at all. Just simply talking, asking, when can I meet the claimant? When can I meet the real party in interest, whoever it is that has the first-hand knowledge of this matter, so I can settle it honorably with them? It is just that simple. Not necessarily that easy. Because
Right.
believe me, some of these people will put you up to the test. In fact, when I was dealing with those last three on the so-called credit score way back when, it kind of went like this. The first one I got rid of in 3 calls, 2 or 3 calls. I think it was actually 3. The second one, it took me closer to 5 or 6 calls and I kept getting a hold of this one girl, and she was sharp. She was hard to get past. She was working my ass over, but I loved it because steel sharpens steel. She made me better. She made me damn good, actually. The last one, it took 1 call. 1 call. I got a hold of the supervisor within about 5 to 10 minutes. And this actually kind of gets into the whole dispute thing. I'm asking the supervisor, when can I meet whoever it is that has the first-hand knowledge? And he's like, well, don't you have first-hand knowledge? And I said, yeah, but I'm not the one claiming that I owe something. I need to talk to whoever on that end so that I can make sure of whatever it is that I do owe, it gets handled. The matter gets settled. And he said, well, I can't really find out whoever it is that has that unless we do an investigation, and we can only do an investigation if you dispute the debt. And I said, brother, why would I do that? If I disputed, I believe I would be in dishonor, because what if I actually do owe it? Why would I do that? This is why I need to talk to the person that has the first-hand knowledge so that I don't go into dishonor, because if I do actually owe it, I certainly want to make sure that I settle this matter fully and completely. And he says, yeah, I get that. I understand that. He said, hold on a minute. He gets off the phone. He comes back and he says, you know what? We can't go ahead and open an investigation without you disputing it. He asked for some of the so-called contact information, so made sure that he had that. A week later, the name receives a letter in the mail. They said here's the amount owed, and we are looking for the person with the first-hand knowledge. We have not yet found that person. By the end of the next week, that one was gone. It was off the credit score. Yeah. Now, this is how I overall analogize all this. When it comes down to it, and especially even more so in court than even creditors, it is that simple, but it's not that easy, because, again, those judges will work you hard. Those judges are gatekeepers. And if you don't prove to them that you know who you are as a player in the game, they will not let you through. But once you do prove to them, it will change your status to where you will be left alone far more than you've ever believed. But what it comes down to is, oh shit, I've kind of lost my train of thought. Oh, when oh shit, I forgot how I was going to articulate this. Anyway, let me think about this for a second here. Kind of blew my train of thought.
You were saying when you start knowing who you are, they're the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you prove to the judge that you know this stuff and you can block everything he's doing, then you will get victory. But most people, they complicate things. Most people, they're fight the.
You're breaking up.
You're breaking up. Now I remember what I was going to say. The way this is, and this is as a contractor, I was a former contractor for damn near 40 years. I did houses for a while, but I actually went into the world of building and remodeling pools. It was actually far more lucrative than doing houses. But anyway, it's like building a house. The simplicity of building a house is nothing more than nailing 2 boards together. Now, obviously, to build a house, there's a lot more than just two boards, but we nail one board to another board to another board to another board. Now, is building a house that easy? Yes, it is, but it is that simple. No, it's pretty damn hard to build a house. You better know how to get those boards nailed together right. You better cut them right. You better put them in the right place, and so on and so forth. It's not that simple to build a house or that easy to build a house, but it is that simple, if that makes sense. So that's something to keep in mind when you're going through this, that there's always going to be people that are going to put up hard obstacles. Well, just like with the girl that I gave Eddie on the second debt, invite that stuff, because that's what's going to make you stronger. That's what's going to make you sharper. Every time you hit an obstacle, meet it face first. Go at it. Because ultimately, especially if it's on the phone with some of these people, they can't hurt you. Just relax. Don't get upset and go into it. Go full tilt, because that's what's going to make you stronger.
And firsthand knowledge, I know you talked about it before, but firsthand knowledge is the corporation having firsthand knowledge, not, say, the agent that had you signing.
But it's all of them.
No,
because none of them have any firsthand knowledge. Yeah.
First-hand knowledge, in other words, Dawn, you were overthinking things. When, let's hypothetically say that, yes, you filled out for a student loan. Was any of the agents of that company watching over your shoulder?
Oh, you're right. Because it was all electronic signature crap.
Exactly.
They have no
bingo.
first-hand knowledge.
Nobody does. In fact, I had a conversation with a dean of the law school because we had a little dispute over something, and I shut her shit down. She was an associate dean. But in the course of some emails, I was asking to speak to the person with the first-hand knowledge. She got all snippy and said, well, I have knowledge. I said, well, that's great. I didn't ask you if you had knowledge. Knowledge is pretty ambiguous. I asked you if you had first-hand knowledge.
Right. And I remember that phone call you did with the the girl who was like, I have knowledge. It's right in front of me in the computer. And you're like, that's not firsthand knowledge. You're just reading from a computer.
Right? Well, because she is. She's just reading from a computer. Yeah. The only one that quite possibly, and I say quite possibly, because I don't know, is whoever entered the information into the computer. And gee, if it's all done electronically, then there is no living man or woman that ever even entered any of that information. So how could they possibly even know anyway?
Right.
Anybody.
Bingo.
So, yeah. And it's funny because, they don't know how to answer some of this stuff. In fact, one of the brothers that's been successful at getting rid of a couple of so-called car loans, one girl made the mistake at one time, and I think it's got it on the video channel that he's known to use. She said, well, it says right here on the computer. He said, the computer said that? She said, yeah. And he said, well, could you ask the computer to speak up because I didn't hear it? She was just baffled. She didn't know what to say about that. But, of course, this gets into words matter, too. Sometimes, it really does matter, the words that we use when we converse with one another. Because how did the computer speak?
Yep.
So, yeah, it's really important. And, of course, when you think, well, I was just going to say, when you think about it, the claimant, the person with the first-hand knowledge, the real party of interest, these are all asking for the same exact person. They're just different phrases to ask for that person. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. And by the way, I used that tactic on Navient when they were calling me, trying to get me to make a payment. But I used the tactic with my name. Like, I'm not that name. Like, I am a living person. And she got so upset with me. We just kept going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Because I'm like, do you have firsthand knowledge of the debt? She's like, yes, it's on the computer. And I'm like, no, that's not firsthand knowledge. And then she kept trying to get me to verify my name. And I'm like, how can I be a name? I'm a living person. Like, I may
Well,
go by that name, but I like Dawn is what I sometimes go by, but that's it.
right.
And she got
Well,
so pissed with me, and I wish I would have recorded that call.
try it this way next time. Take everything that you stated, reword it a little bit to be able to put a question mark at the end and ask it as a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it becomes even more powerful, because now you're getting them to think about how it could possibly be any of the things that they're claiming. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And one of the things too, and this is going to get pretty deep into the whole idea of even the Christian given name that mom called us when we was youngins. In the beginning of time, all names, all things started off as grunts and groans, sounds coming out the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, long before anything was ever written ink on paper. So it's not about the ink on paper. It's more about the sounds that come out of other people's mouths. We do not typically speak of ourselves by calling the name out. And when we are speaking about ourselves, we just usually say I, me, whatever.
Right.
So typically speaking, the only time that the name is actually used is when someone else is attempting to get our attention. It's not you using the name, it's everyone else but you. And this is where the real caveat comes in. How does one own a sound that comes out of somebody else's mouth? This is the reality of it. This is actually the reality of it. And it's down to, this is what gets into the first principles of reasoning, where you break everything down to the very basis of what it actually is. No illusions, no assumptions, just what is it actually? Well, what the name is actually is a sound that comes out of somebody else's mouth. How does one own something that comes out of someone else's mouth? If somebody can explain that to me, now we've got something to talk about. But until then, we're talking about reality, and that a sound can't be owned. It can only be heard. And specifically, I do realize that in terms of music, there's allegedly so-called copyrights. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the sounds coming out of somebody's mouth, especially in the essence of saying the name.
So what would you suggest because One Main Financial is the most annoying to me right now.
I dealt with them. I know.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
So I've already sent the do not contact stuff, and they haven't. But what they have do is they've constantly sent me bills, which I just send back to them saying, I do not accept this. And then I'll send them this thing asking them to please fill out this affidavit and please send me all this information regarding where the money came from that you say that I owe you. And all they keep doing is sending me back my accounting, not their accounting. And so it's this hot potato back and forth. So I want to change things up because they're really persistent. So what would you suggest I try?
Started asking them to meet the claimant, the real party in interest. That's it. Tell them that you want to settle this matter honorably with the person, the man or woman, the real living, breathing man or woman that is claiming that you owe something to them, so that you can settle the matter honorably with them. And of course, one way to do it too is to ask whoever it is that's claiming to have had the meeting of the minds with me. That's another way of asking for the same thing. But by asking that in that specific manner, it now puts the other people on notice that you know that in order for there to have been a contract, there must have been a meeting of the minds. And for any so-called attorneys that are worth their weight in salt, they know that there was no meeting of the minds. That's why I was kind of mentioning the nursing homes about the mom, them attaching the estate, because, yeah, you start
And who would
asking
I
whoever has
call?
the meeting of the minds, and nobody in the real sense that's ever gone through law school, if they took especially contracts to heart, they know that there was never a meeting of the minds. They know that it cannot happen with something that's not of legal capacity. And of course, all corporations, all stacks of paper are not of legal capacity, because you cannot ask it, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? They know
Okay, and
this.
who would I call? The CEO? Would I call just anybody at One Main at the branch
Yeah,
over
just
here?
anybody. And just call over there and just start asking to meet with the person, whoever has the firsthand knowledge, whoever it was that's claiming to have had a meeting of the minds with you, so that you can settle the matter honorably with them and have love in your heart. This is one
Right.
of the things that you have to do, is have love in the heart. And, even if they get you upset, still just keep love in the heart for them. Because I can assure you, if you have war in your heart, that will shine through, and you won't be nearly as
Correct.
successful as if you have love in the heart. Because
Correct.
again, if you have war in the heart, you're going to be in dishonor too, because you're
Yep.
going in there with the idea of conflict. And you don't
Mm-hmm.
want
You
conflict. You
don't
just
want,
simply want to
yeah, you
settle the
want to
matter.
de-escalate.
Right, exactly. You just simply want to settle the matter honorably. That's all you want to do. And of course, the only way possible to do that is with the real party in interest.
Okay. And so then if the girl that was there, that I had a phone conversation with, comes on the phone and says, well, I'm the one that set up the account with you, and we have a recording of the whole thing.
Right?
And I used the whole thing as though, yes, but you didn't see me sign, did you?
Yeah, don't even go there. One of the
Okay.
things you have to keep in mind is this. No agent can ever exceed the capacity of the principal for which they are claiming to represent. So if that piece of paper with ink on it doesn't have the capacity to contract with you, nor does that agent. So no matter what she says, she couldn't contract with you either. And it still doesn't matter. She could say that she
She's the living
witnessed this, that, and
woman.
the other, but she's still not the one that is alleging to have
Right.
the
It's the
meeting of the minds with
corporation.
you. Right. There was still
Oh,
no,
crap. That's right.
yeah.
I got to
So,
go back and re-listen to your videos.
yeah, because if you don't have, no matter what they say, if you're not talking to the real party of interest, you're just talking to a meddling interloper. And you
Yep.
certainly don't
Yep.
want to do that, because they're just dealing with hearsay. So,
That's
yeah, it
right.
doesn't matter whatever anybody says. And of course, like I was mentioning earlier, too, about the witnesses and or parties in an event and their continuity and consistency amongst their testimony, because even people in an event don't always recall it the same as it exactly was. He was tall, he was short, he was this, he was that, whatever. And then there's the other part of that whole problem too, and that is the game telephone. Anybody that's ever played the game telephone knows that once the story leaves the very first person, that story starts to change incrementally all the way down the line, to where by the time it gets down, and depending on how long the line is, that story isn't even close to the same by the time it gets to the end.
Right.
Okay, so this is part of why it is so damned important to have the real party of interest, the only one with the first-hand knowledge in front of you, to settle the matter honorably with them. Because it's too hard, and I'll be the first to admit that there's been times where I've had conversations with people where I may have forgot exactly what was said. There's times when I've been involved in something where I may not have thought it or remembered it the way it exactly was. Our knowledge, our firsthand experience, is only really as good as our ability to accurately recall it.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you have the real party of interest in front of you, if that was ever to happen, it's still based upon their ability to recall accurately as well. And of course, they're never going to be, because there's never going to be a time where the stack of paper with ink on it steps forward in front of you to make those claims. It just doesn't happen. And that's the whole key element right here, is if it happens on a private level, such as if you and I were to contract done, that would be a private contract between you and I. But once we step out of that and we're dealing with so-called corporations, we're now not only out of the private, but we're also dealing in the world of illusion and fictions. Because the corporation is nothing more than a fiction. And of course, there's another aspect to think about. The word corporation, is denoting a dead thing. Well, technically speaking, the corporation, the concept of a corporation really is more inanimate because it was never alive to begin with. It's really not dead. It's just inanimate. The difference is when you put that ink to paper, especially back in the day, the earliest days of written contracts, all that stuff was natural material. It was alive at one time, and it is now dead in its present state as it is being written paper with ink. That part is actually dead. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's called a civilly dead entity.
Yes. Now, obviously, think about this. How can a dead thing, not even a fiction, not a cartoon, but something dead, something in the grave, how does that own something? How does it lend something? How can a dead thing lend anything, own anything, do anything? And of course, then obviously have authority over the real living man or woman. And
which
this
is why
also
you can
includes
never
that
really
courtroom. What's that?
right, and which is why you can never really sue a corporation either. It's very hard to sue.
Right.
So it affords them some liability, but it also can be used to our advantage.
Well, yeah, but this is also part of why, too, I talk about if there ever is a situation where you're going to sue, you sue Joe Schmuck, the ragman. You don't sue the president of the company. You don't sue the judge. You don't sue the cop. You don't sue the DA. You sue the real man or woman. Right. Because, of course, then the whole key element there at the back end when it hits court is they're going to claim that they are representing the state, which now puts the burden of proof on them. They have to bring that piece of paper with ink in it to the courtroom and get it to step up onto the stand and give firsthand testimony.
See, a lot of this that he's talking about is the reason why I say a lot of the same things I say, because it's not. When you start understanding the principles and you start understanding the basic things about the system, it's really not very difficult.
No.
The principles are always there.
Right.
Puff, puff, pass, Popeye. Puff, puff, pass.
Hit it again.
Yes, for everyone. Come on over.
The most used word in the English vocabulary is here.
Well, of course, one of the things, especially when it comes to when you receive something in the so-called mail, first and foremost, if it's anything, even if they've used upper and lower case, which a lot of times they do, they will do that purposely to try and confuse anybody, especially if they already realize that something in all uppercase is not you, is that legal name. But anything that's a legal document that, even if it's like from a so-called credit card company or credit or debt collector, if there's a so-called social security number involved anywhere at any time, which it always is, they're referring to that legal name. Well, when it comes to that, you have to realize that that's their stuff, but it's also the funnel for which all your benefits as a so-called beneficiary would be funneled to the real living man or woman. So it's something that you have to be cognizant of, to where you can literally play some of these games very much bleeding the hair at the moment. And what I'm talking about is this: at any time that you're doing any of these things, you're recognizing, like on, say, the application for a so-called driver's license. And of course, most of your credit cards and all this other stuff, they always ask you this simple little question: Are you a U.S. citizen? Well, you as the real living man or woman may not be. I don't know. If you understand what a U.S. citizen is, and that is one that must be a resident of the 10 square mile area known as the District of Columbia, well, that name is. The name is.
Right.
The name is the
Because
resident
it's
of that
attached to
area.
the birth
That's where,
certificate.
yeah. So when it comes to some of these documents, if you recognize that there's a separation between you and that name, it's okay to go ahead and check that. Most people would argue that, but you're going to enter into the contract and you're going to be. No, you're not. No, you're not. Because you recognize the fact that, number one, who's claiming that you're liable for that name? Nobody.
Right.
There's not going to be anybody stepping up saying, well, yeah, I'm the one, because the Social Security Administration, again, is another piece of paper with ink on it. So you can do a lot of this stuff and have the freedom of maneuvering, so to speak, freely within the matrix by being able to separate you from the name and check these certain boxes, recognizing that it's not you specifically. And of course, you recognize too that even though you've checked, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's been a meeting of the minds, because who was your real party of interest? So you're still separated here. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So this way you can actually maneuver through, you can collect whatever benefits you want, and realize that as the beneficiary, you're not obligated in any way, shape, or form to the trust. And as the only real party of interest, until you've met the other real party of interest, there is no contract. It provides you quite a bit of freedom. And of course, in all of this, you want to be a good person too. You don't want to necessarily be a belligerent, be outside of reasonableness and prudency, because this is where I believe it was Churchill or Eisenhower, one of those guys back during the Second World War, that said something to the effect of, there will be those that govern from within and those that will certainly need to be governed from without. Well, that's where government steps in. There's those that govern from within and they never get talked to, they never get touched. But then there's those that are acting belligerent and unreasonable, and they get tossed in a cage, and sometimes quite a lot.
And then they sit and cry that government's corrupt when they can't even govern themselves.
Well, there you go. There you go. And this is one of those fine lines where, is for as much as I will say that I've been totally anti-government, and I still believe that we need something more benevolent than what we have now, and something that's not a private for-profit corporation, but that's a whole nother story. But the reality is, as it stands, for what it's there for, it works pretty damn good, because it does keep the belligerents in line and in the cage when they won't step up. And as having been one of those belligerents, and then realized along the way that one of the biggest problems is that I was the problem. And most people don't get that. That typically speaking, we're our own worst enemy. There may be other enemies out there, but we're our own worst. Because if you think back at all the things that has ever happened bad, it was always due to a decision that you made somewhere along the way. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily initiated it, but because of the decisions you made, you were still culpable. Right. And the analogy that I use for most people to help them understand how they may not have actually decided to do something, but it was their decisions that actually ended up causing something that was detrimental to them. You go to a party, you're wearing your favorite shirt, you're just sitting on the couch, people are having a good time, somebody bumps into somebody else, not meaning to do so, no anger, no nothing. Oops, there goes the glass of wine onto your favorite shirt. Now it's stained permanently. Shirt done. Are you culpable for that shirt being stained? Yeah, because you made several decisions that put you there. Doesn't mean that you actually did anything, but you're still culpable because of the decisions you made. If you don't understand these simple facts, you spend the rest of your life pointing at fingers at everybody else, but not realizing that the real problem was still you. Because you could have stayed home, but then again, if you stayed home, it could have been that there was a weird mid-air collision and a plane landed on the house and you got killed. And that's not too far out of the fact, because I actually live not too far from an airport where probably about 20 years ago, a small plane actually hit an apartment, hit the wall. On the other side of that wall was the bed where the man was still in bed asleep. Gone. Bam. Yes, it's a strange anomaly, but it happens anyway.
You ever
Well,
have you
yeah,
ever
could it be?
Have you ever heard of the butterfly effect?
Yep.
Yes.
The butterfly effect, there's truth in that.
Yep. Yep.
Every
And
decision someone makes
Affects
it affects
the
everything
outcome.
thereafter.
Yep.
That's why
Yep.
that's why you've heard me say it. It was the responsible party in my life, me, because I'm one that I didn't.
All right,
well, that's
coming in
part of
now.
why on most every decision that I make, especially like with when I decided to send the adequate assurance of due performance to these mortgage companies, I thought long and hard about it. I wanted to be sure exactly, and I thought about all the different aspects as much as I possibly could of, even if things didn't go well for me, if everything went south, and was I okay with it? Because I had to be 100% not in fear of what I'm about to do here, so that I could perform completely free, mind free of the anxiety of, oh my God, if I don't make this happen, I'm up shit creek without a paddle. I don't give a shit at this point. I'm completely okay with everything. No matter what happens, I'm okay with it. But the reality is, I think that that's one of those things too, that just like with so many other things in martial arts, you train to where you're at that point where you don't have to think about things. You react to what is happening. The reason why athletes train extensively and exhaustively is to where they're at that point where, especially in action sports, they're reacting to what's happening. They don't have to think about it. Thinking about it takes too much time. Reacting is instantaneous. That's why they even warm up prior to. That's part of why I like to have the so-called creditors just call me at the spur of the moment, because if I ever end up where I've got somebody serious in front of me, some called GovCo agent, or I'm in court or whatever, I've already got lots of experience. And that experience, especially with these calls, comes at a moment's notice with no time to warm up. I just got to go full onion as soon as that phone rings. I got to pick it up and I got to be on my game.
So, would you ever consider like doing a YouTube live and doing kind of role play with this stuff?
Yeah. And I would do it here in one of these calls too. I'd role play with somebody anytime. Yeah. I've done a lot of role playing. In fact, the brother that teaches most of this stuff, we call him Batman, he used to do role playing. And the brothers that I have role played with, the reason why is because Batman just stopped role playing somewhere along the way. But I think it's essential to role play. When I was in corporate sales, we role played all the time. If we weren't on the phone or out in the field, we were role playing. And I'm not shitting you. We were constantly role playing. Yeah, you have to be sharp. You have to be good. And one of the best people to hone you is another salesman with experience, because they've already heard all the objections. They know how to throw them at you. And you get sharper.
So does Olive Oil know about you and your fetish with role playing?
Oh, yeah. In fact,
you don't even want to know.
We've role played a couple times. He gets mad at me. What's that?
I said, you don't even want to know the outfits Popeye and Olive Oil put
on. Yeah, that's an ugly picture if you saw me. She's not so bad. She's pretty easy on the eyes, actually. Still pretty
Yeah, I
cute.
mean, it's you don't have to be this big time legal mind, what they would call an attorney. All you got to do is know the basic principles and be able to be quick on your feet so you can respond accordingly when the judge asks questions. And most people are not ready for that. Most people do not know how to respond to the other person on the phone or in court.
Stop talking. Stop
look
talking
at-
about me.
Go back and watch the video Yusufel put up about the sovereign citizen fail. That video is classic example of someone that thought they was ready and was not ready for the judge.
Right.
No, but what that does, though, that's also a great video for anybody like us to listen to that judge and understand how a judge, in a general sense, because each judge is going to be a little different, but all pretty close to the same, how a judge is going to handle if you make a mistake like the sovereign citizen does, what the judge is going to say, how he's going to handle it. And then it gives you the opportunity to think, oh, well, how would I get this back on track? How would I get back on point?
I loved that judge in that video. He was absolutely freaking phenomenal.
Oh, he's brilliant.
He was.
Oh, he was absolutely brilliant, in my opinion. Hands off. Total hats off, man. I applaud that judge, man. He kicked the dude's ass, and I loved it. I thought it was great.
Because he actually gave the guy every opportunity to fix his mistakes. But the guy didn't
Oh,
want
yeah.
it.
And that, of course, in that video is one of those things where you go to the part where the guy mentions pay, and that judge nails his ass to the wall. To the wall. Now, one of the things, and I will throw this out, anybody that is starting to understand my basic philosophy and where I come from, when you listen to Yusufel and some of his reaction, you'll probably pick up a few areas where I would completely disagree with him. But I will say this. In some areas, though, Yusufel is absolutely perfectly spot on. Because when he's citing certain codes, statutes, regulations, he's giving you the exact real deal. Because, of course, all this stuff is stuff that you can look up yourself to see, well, yeah, that's exactly what he said. And, yeah, Popeye said the same shit. He was spot on. And so from those standpoints, and this is the thing that I tell everybody, that if you want to do knowing who you are 101, you just need that crash course, role play, and get used to just a couple different things. First and foremost, get used to not making any claims, because if you can't prove it, why claim it? If it's just hearsay to you, why claim it? If you can't remember it accurately and correctly, and you can't provide the evidence, the tangible evidence, why claim it? Then three questions.
What I say about that is the biggest thing I say about the name. And people will say, well, that was my mother's intention. But your mother's never put up the claim.
Well, there you
and
go.
On top of that, by operation of law, any woman will tell you when they're giving birth, they're not competent.
Right. Well, then when it comes down to it, the basics, the bare basics, what you need to know and or keep in mind in all situations is three basic questions. And then there will be a fourth default for any kind of hinky situations that might seemingly get out of hand. First and foremost, is there a claimant? You ask them, is there a claimant? Now, most of the time, if you're dealing with a so-called GovCo agent, they'll answer questions 1 and 2 almost simultaneously, because they'll almost always say, yes, it's the state, or it's the people of the state, and or the county, the city, whatever, Okay, great. So you just covered question number 2. Who is the claimant? They just answered for you. But if they didn't answer, if they just said, yes, there is a claimant, then you ask, who is that claimant? Then once they answer, and after every question, you just shut up. Just don't say another word. Let them answer. Don't lead them. Don't do anything more. Just ask the question, shut up. Then when they're done answering whatever, then you ask that third question. when can I meet the claimant? And again, just shut up. That fourth question that always smooths out all situations, basically puts the other person in check, is asking, are you putting up surety for that claim? I can assure you, just like with the judge and DAs, they will run from you if they really understand. If they don't, they might be stupid and say, oh, well, nobody's putting up surety. Well, you made the claim. I believe you're the one that's going to be putting up surety, because that's how it is. Onus probandi is he who makes the claim must prove that claim. And if they cannot provide the evidence to prove their claim, that claim must be found against them. So they better be providing the surety, because that claim is going to be found against them. And again, it is just that simple. Now, the thing that I tell everybody, if you want to really get into some good, better, best questions, and anybody that, especially people that have watched the Kerry Zolman video, you understand what I'm already getting into here, because there is good, better, best. There absolutely is. And when you start to understand this, it gives you the ability then to ask great questions, no matter what somebody says in front of you. And then you always use that to redirect right back to where you want to be, which is you want to know who is, when, where that claimant is. You got to bring it back to, when can I meet the claimant? Great. So who's claiming that? If they say you're a sovereign citizen, have them define whatever the hell they think is a sovereign citizen. And as soon as they're done, say, great, who's claiming that and where's the evidence of such? And of course, the only one that could ever have true evidence is the one that's making the claim.
Ooh, I had the gas company basically state that a technique I was using for, what is it, the debt thing, the received for value or something like that. She quoted a website of the Treasury, I believe, that claimed that sovereign citizens were trying to do a false method of paying off a bill, and there's a cess decay, blah, 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 and that sovereign citizens are terrorists, and they...
Oh, shoot. I would have said, will you put that on record? Because I would freaking make the accusation of libel and slander.
Well,
yeah, I need to go back.
I would actually ask first and foremost, who is someone claiming that I am such a thing? I would ask that question. Is someone claiming that I am such a thing? And
That'll
if
be
she
a short
said
letter.
that she was, then I'd ask her, where's your evidence of such? In fact, there was way back when I had a couple of brothers that I was helping with so-called traffic tickets, and they both ended up with judges, one here in California, the other one in South Carolina. They were about 2 weeks apart, but the judge said some of the same thing because they were asking questions and such, and the judge kind of was having a hard time answering some of them and getting a little itchy. So he said something to the effect of, I know a sovereign citizen and I know how to deal with you too. And they both said, I'm not a sovereign citizen, which is kind of a big mistake because they just claimed one, or actually really three different things at once. First, that whatever the judge thought was a sovereign citizen was the same thing that they thought was a sovereign citizen, and they actually agreed on whatever a sovereign citizen might have been. That was the wrong thing to do. The first thing you do is, like I said, you ask the judge, what do you mean by a sovereign citizen? And then you shut up, let that judge ramble on. I don't give a shit if that judge rambles for 40, 50 minutes. You let that judge ramble. Do not interrupt him. When he is done, you simply ask, are you claiming that I am such a thing? And if so, where is your evidence? Oh, and by the way, are you putting up surety for that claim? I can assure you that judge is going to shut the hell up.
Uh-huh.
He's going to shut his freaking mouth and not say another word. I know, because I've asked these questions of people in such positions. I asked it of a so-called sheriff's deputy one time. I was asking him questions because he was kind of getting up in my face, and he asked me, "Are you one of those sovereign citizens?" And I asked him, "What's a sovereign citizen?" This dumbass literally said, "If you don't know what a sovereign citizen is, you're not one." And I said, "Oh, okay, thanks a lot, brother. I'll see you later. Is it okay if I go ahead and take off now?" He said, "Yeah, get out of here."
A friend of mine was in court one day, and the judge asked him, "Are you one of those sovereign citizens?" He said, "Well, Your Honor, would you please define what that means so I make sure we're on the same page?" He said, "Because based on my knowledge, the only sovereign citizen in this room is you, Your Honor, because you're the sovereign of the court and a citizen of the state." The judge went freaking silent.
Well, yeah, what's he going to say?
Not a thing.
And the thing is, and
What
this is
can
the
he
thing going
say?
back to, and this is one of the things to go back to, and anybody that doesn't know what I'm talking about, preacher, if you got the link handy for the Kerry Zolman video, one of the things
one?
the one where he talks about when he was in the court, when he was wearing the one where he's wearing the orange shirt.
There's
Anyway.
3 of them where he's wearing the orange shirt.
Oh,
and
shit.
I posted the 45-minute video where he talks about taxes.
Well,
and
yeah,
where you're
I think it's in that one.
Yeah, I posted that. It's on my page.
Okay. On that, in that video, just real quick to kind of get to the words, and this is part of why I refer back to it, because if none of these people are going to be able to define anything, if you ask them, they can't. And even if you try to get the so-called definitions out of their own so-called code statutes or whatever, the reality is this: they do not want to, nor can they be bound by these words. They have to leave the ambiguity in place. It's imperative for them. Part of the reason why when Kerry Zolman wanted to put the so-called glossary from the IRS code in the record, they wouldn't accept it. But the reality of it is that by doing so, they not only left the ambiguity for themselves, but they also left it for him. Most people don't realize that pendulum swings all directions. It swings not just for them, but for you too. As long as you understand, again, who you are as a player in the game. He talks about in this video how he didn't claim the name. But one of the things, and the reason why I'm getting to this is, at one point, he talks about how they asked him a question. He starts talking about his truck, and they're like, "What the hell are you talking about your truck for?" Well, he said, "Well, because from his mouth to my ears, he asked me about my truck." Because the reality is this: if they weren't the author of any so-called code, statute, or regulation, they don't truly know what the author had in mind. So they cannot truly give you the definition because they truly don't know. It's only their opinion. And they can't put up surety for their opinion because, like we were talking about earlier, they'd be doing so on their own accord. They'd be liable for any decisions they made.
I think I seen that video. They asked him what his name was, and he's talking about a car.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
He started giving
something
a
about
picture of a car or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole thing is what it comes down to is if you're not asking the right questions to get them to define exactly what it is that they're saying, then you're accepting what they're saying without truly knowing what it is that they're saying. That's really the whole thing. And what the kind of the shortened version of it comes down to this. Most of these agents, cops, DAs, IRS agents, whatever, they're trained to ask you questions that you're not possibly going to truly know what they're asking, but they're also relying on you as the one in front of them to be afraid of looking stupid in their eyes. They truly are, because most people will play on this. They are afraid of looking stupid in the eyes of whoever's in front of them. So instead of asking the questions like they don't know what these words mean, they'll just agree so as to not look stupid. Well, one of the reasons why I go in acting country, jump right up front, because I don't give a shit. I don't care if they think I'm dumber than dirt. I want them thinking that, because I'm going to be asking them questions that they ain't going to be able to answer. I'm going to ask them softball questions that their answer going to lay out that playing field. Then I'm going to ask them the hardball questions, and they're going to realize at that time, I ain't so country dumb. I'm actually one sharp mofo, and they just been had. I don't care about looking dumb in their eyes. I'll ask them what they mean by the word is, Bill Clinton. What do you mean by is? And I'm not shitting, because it literally comes down to that. It truly is. In fact, the analogy that I use to help people understand this is the 50 Shades of Grey, not for the book or the film, because that's a great topic. Sex is a contract, because it is. No, just the 50 Shades of Grey. Let's just say that there are 50 shades of gray. I'm sure there probably is more in the color spectrum, but let's just keep it at 50. If I'm writing some code, statute, legislation, whatever, and I use the word gray in a sentence, and I'm thinking the darkest shade of gray, knowing that most people are going to think of a medium shade of gray, I've already deceived most people by at least half of that number, by 25 shades, 50%. Now, the people that thought of the darkest shade of gray, they were not deceived at all, but the one that thought of at least one shade lighter was 2% deceived, all the way down to the person that thought of the lightest shade of gray, which was 100% deceived. And now, since I've died, the carbon-based material that I was known to use has now disintegrated. You, as a prosecutor, a cop, or anybody else, you cannot come to me and ask me what I meant by it, so you're just left to guess. But the reality is, I left it ambiguous for you. I totally left it to where, say you're a criminal prosecutor. If the defendant is thinking of that medium shade, you only need to go up one shade and you win, because now you're one shade closer to the truth of what I actually wrote than the defendant. So you're closer to the reality of what it actually meant, what my actual intent was. But you could actually go the other way and still win too, because I left it completely ambiguous for you. It's ambiguous for the defendant too, but if the defendant doesn't realize it, they're just stuck with what they thought. But you, as the prosecutor, I've given you the open door to do whatever you need to get your win. Most people have no idea about some of this stuff, but I can assure you that some of these pieces of legislation not only are written like that, but they actually argue, and some stuff will actually stall in committee, not come out of committee and ever be written totally as a bill or anything. And I can assure you, because when I was in pre-law, one of the first assignments was to look up something that had been stalled and find out why and do a paper on it. I found this piece of legislation that was supposed to be a financial consumer act, or consumer safety act, actually. And it was stalled over one word, and the word was would. The legislators, some of them that originally wrote some sentence that stated something to the effect of, if such and such happens, it would put the safety of the financial industry at risk. It said it would. Well, some of the legislators didn't like that. They wanted plausible deniability, so they wanted the word may. And this piece of legislation at that time had been stalled for 13 months over one word. One word.
So they wanted to replace the word would with the word name.
Yes. So that they could say, well, it may have put the financial industry at risk, not would. So that they could say, well, we didn't know for sure. We knew that it may, but we didn't know for sure. Whereas the reality is they knew for sure, because they wrote it with would, because they knew it would. Yeah. That's how much ambiguity they will write into some of this shit. In fact, when I was in actual law school, I had two different conversations where two different professors completely acknowledged and confirmed the ambiguity of the system. One talked about how the so-called lawmakers were about to go back into session, and I made the remark, oh, yes, so that they can make things even more or less ambiguous than they already are. And her one-word answer was exactly, to more or less ambiguous than they already are. A week after that, week or so, I have another conversation, and this is with one that's actually an associate dean of the school, and he's talking about the ambiguity of the system and essentially the common law at this time, our present modern day common law, which is essentially a judge's opinion on something, and how you can't get three judges to agree to drinking coffee from the coffee machine as they're standing at the coffee machine drinking from that damn machine. And I made the comment, yes, the ambiguity that I love so much. This professor actually said in lecture in front of all the other students, it's all ambiguous. If it wasn't, we would all be looking for something else to do. He basically said, without saying it, that it doesn't mean shit unless you believe it does, because it is that ambiguous.
Like the ambiguously gay duo. They used to be on, who was that? Conan, right?
Yes.
Or no,
So.
SNL.
Which one? Oh,
Saturday Night
I think it
Live.
was SNL, actually. I think it
Duo.
was.
Would you guys be willing to just read over a letter to the woman who tried to, in a roundabout way, label me as a sovereign citizen if I download it?
Yeah, send it to me if you can. I'll read it.
Obviously you're on here, so I'll DM it to
you.
you.
Yeah, just send it over and I'll read it. I love that kind of stuff because, it especially now at my position, I find so much of it just hilarious because people will make all kinds of crazy claims that they cannot prove one way or another. And, this whole thing of a sovereign citizen, if you were to look at a couple of different things, first and foremost, a citizen is under government. A sovereign is one that's over everything. I don't know how you can be under and over at the same time. That would seem to be an oxymoron. Now, I've heard some argue that it's not an oxymoron. It's just that and the other thing. No, it's an oxymoron. Because a citizen, especially if you go by Black's Law 6, is one that submits to the dominion of government. But it's also one that has a duty of allegiance, depending on what definition you use of a basic citizen. Not a U.S. citizen. That's something different. But, yeah.
And a sovereign is one that, and a sovereign has an allegiance to his creator or God or whomever, correct?
Yeah.
So it can't be, you
there's
can't be
God
both.
and nobody else. Because if you look up, and this is how you do it, brother, look up. And if you're inside the house, well, it still works, but go outside, it's even better. You look up, and if you don't see the soles of the feet of another man or woman, then there's only God. And until somebody can prove that they're over me with evidence that they're over me, they ain't got shit. There's only me and God. And one of the Bible verses that kind of talks about this is John 21:21. Says, if I will him to be here, what is that to you? Basically, it means that your relationship with God is yours and yours alone, and it doesn't entail anybody else, including your wife, the children, nobody, your mama, nobody. Everybody else is out the picture. You are a son of God. You are a daughter of God. We are all children of God. until somebody can prove otherwise. And of course, this is one of those things too. Despite all the so-called government, so-called paperwork that discloses that you can't own anything, in the Bible it says God granted dominion of the earth and all things on it to man, not ownership. Well, somebody please provide the so-called title deed with God's name and signature on it. And of course, I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but if they can provide that, now we got something to actually talk about as far as ownership. But until they can provide that they own it over God, even if you don't believe in God, how are you going to claim ownership of something that's way older than you? It's going to outlast you. It can swallow you up and never spit you out, and you can't do anything like that to it. You're going to claim ownership of that? Y'all crazy. Y'all crazy. You're insane to think that you can own something that can swallow you up and never spit you back out, has outlasted you and will outlast you. Give me a break. How are you going to claim ownership of that?